Chapter 379. Deng Ziyu thought for a moment and understood the commissioner's words very clearly. The so-called head of Northern Qi was indeed a risky assignment. However, it was also the most important link on the Overwatch Council's external battlefront. Anyone who had held this position would be given an important position after returning home. There was no need to talk about the previous Yin Bingyun, Sir Yin Jr. At such a young age, he had already become the head of the 4th Bureau. Everyone knew that after Director Chun retired and Sir Fan Jr. took over the position of director, Sir Yin Jr. would certainly have an even more important assignment. Deng Ziyu's familiar old superior, Wang Qinian, had been in the council for 10 years. The moment he met Fan Xian, he had been sent to Northern Qi. Hearing the commissioner's earlier words, after Wang Qinian returned home, he would also become the new head of the 1st Bureau. The trip to Northern Qi was risky, but it was also political gilding. The commissioner had asked him if he was willing to go to Northern Qi because he was prepared to promote him. Furthermore, he had heard that the old head of the 2nd Bureau was getting old and preparing to retire. He had also come from the 2nd Bureau. Deng Ziyu's heart was endlessly excited. He knelt in front of Fan Xian and said in a low voice, "I will listen to your arrangements." Fan Xian smiled and didn't continue to say anything. Through the Jiangnan matter, he felt more and more that although the emperor trusted him greatly, he still absolutely prevented him from having any connection with the military. It was to the extent that when he did things, the absolute power he held in his hands was still limited. Otherwise, he would not be so afraid of the existence of the Jiangnan governor, Xueqing. The person sitting on the throne didn't even trust his legitimate son, much less Fan Xian. Fan Xian knew that it was already good that the emperor had given him so much power. However, he also knew that the other party would not allow him to expand his power. Since it was difficult to obtain power from outside, then Fan Xian had to hold the power he already held more firmly. For example, the Overwatch Council in the post-Xi Jinping era had to change its blood. It had to be replenished with new blood loyal to him. Deng Ziyu reported to him the Overwatch Council's recent actions in Jiangnan. The main focus was still on the Ming family. Although the Overwatch Council was in charge of supervising the governance of officials and did not have direct power over the power of the people, there was no lack of reasons from the government in this world. The Overwatch Council had already made early preparations. At any time, they could follow Fan Xian's orders and intervene in Jiangnan affairs. From the palace treasury to Suzhou to the docks, from the tents to the warehouses, they would suppress the Ming family in all aspects. This was all Fan Xian could do at the moment. Since they could not find concrete evidence of the Ming family's crimes, it was impossible to use official power to suppress them. The officials of Jiangnan Road were all watching him. Presently, the Overwatch Council's job was to further reduce the Ming family's income through harassment of the Ming family's trade routes, as well as the Palace Treasury Transport Company tampering with the supply of goods. This would cause the other party's flowing silver to sink into a shortage. Only by doing this could they force the Ming family to continue moving silver on a large scale. And the method was actually hidden in the transfer of silver. How long has it been since there was any news from the island? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. The island matter that was enough to crush the Ming family had suddenly sunk into silence. Deng Ziyu heard Fan Xian's worry and also had some misgivings in his heart. He reported, "The Chuanzhou branch also feels that the matter is strange and has already sent people to the island. There will probably be news back the day after tomorrow." Jiangnan was vast. It would take too long for news to travel from the islands of the Eastern Sea to Suzhou. Fan Xian knew that he could only wait for now. After Deng Ziyu left, only then did Fan Xian feel a little tired. He stretched and walked out of the room, taking a stroll in Hua Garden. Although the Hua Garden was Yang Jimei's luxurious garden, it wasn't tainted with too much of the wealthy aura of a salt merchant or the arrogant smell of illicit salt peddlers. Instead, it was beautiful and elegant. The shallow flowing water, verdant fake mountains, layer upon layer of mountain peaks, and the pavilions that lined the corridors and the mountain pavilions were all arranged by the skillful hands of the designer back then. The entire garden seemed to have come to life, like the verdant mountains of Jiangnan, like the clear water of West Lake, gently and lightly surrounding the people in the garden. This kind of skillful arrangement of man and nature being one was, without question, what the direct descendant of Tianyi Dao, Haitang, most of her time in Suzhou, was spent quietly thinking in the garden and did not go out to seek out the elegance of the Jiangnan people. Thus, when Fan Xian saw the flowery clothing by the little lake, he was not surprised. Such a thing as fishing does not seem to suit you. He walked to the edge of the lake and sat down. He was slightly closer to the shore than Haidang. There was a foot of distance between the two of them. From this angle, he could just see Haitang's steady shoulders and the flowery cloth wrapped around her head. Beside her was a normal yellow straw hat. Haidang did not turn her head and replied evenly, "Why not?" The bamboo pole in her hand did not move at all. Only the tip of the pole nodded as if greeting the fish in the water. There was no other meaning. Fan Xian smiled and rubbed his moss-covered hands carelessly by his side. Fishing is also killing. I'll teach you a method. You don't need to put out bait. Just use your heart to fish. This was a trick he had read in the novels of his previous life. In those mysterious novels, mysterious characters like to play the most. Unexpectedly, Haidang still did not turn her head or move. On the contrary, she laughed mockingly and said, "What a boring thing. If you don't use bait, does that mean you don't want to fish?" Fishing in the heart. Since what you seek is temperament, if your heart is hooked, then naturally you're hooking. As for whether or not you can hook it, what difference does it make? Fan Xian was angry and bitter. He just wanted to chat. Why did she have to create such a pointless conversation? Haidang turned her head to glance at him and smiled. "I know your heart hasn't been calm these days. Why don't we sit together? Fishing is very good at calming the heart." Fan Xian shook his head and smiled. A gentleman stays away from the kitchen, much less a fishing net and hunting fork. Haitang couldn't resist rolling her eyes at him and shaking her head. Hypocritical fellow. Fan Xian chuckled and moved forward a little. Unexpectedly, his bottom slipped and he almost slid into the lake. It made his hands and feet flustered and he began to cry out. There were rocks by the lake, but no trees or grass. Other than Haidang, there was no place for him to lean on. Very naturally, his hands grabbed onto Haitang's shoulders. Haitang's shoulders shook slightly and shook his hands away. She turned her hand around to hold onto his wrist and helped him stabilize his balance. Smiling slightly, she said, "Not only are you hypocritical, even your acting is so fake. How can it be a 9th level ace in this world who can't even sit steadily?" Fan Xian raised his head to the sky and sighed. "The world doesn't know me, and Duo doesn't believe me. How can I live like this?" Haitang flipped her wrist and had him sit beside her. Very naturally, she took out another fishing rod beside her and stuffed it into Fan Xian's hand. "Since you want to fish, you have to be patient. Don't rush." Her words carried a double meaning, but Fan Xian knew that she was not talking about the problem of picking up girls. Rather, it was the problem of dealing with the situation in Jiangnan. He smiled and took out an earthworm from the small clay jar beside him. He hung on the hook and dropped it into the water. He then scattered some of the scraps Duo had prepared and put them into the water to lure the fish. The lakeside immediately entered a state of calm. A moment later, Fan Xian's clear and light voice broke this rare tacit understanding. "I am patient and I am not in a rush. The situation in Jiangnan is not difficult to control. Furthermore, the plan has been set. I have the confidence to walk it step by step. The problem is that Jiangnan is watching Jingdou, but I cannot control what will happen in Jingdou. Things there could develop in the direction I want them to, or they could suddenly erupt into a major incident that no one can react to." Major incident? Correct. Fan Xian didn't continue. He only carried a glimmer of doubt and a glimmer of sincere admiration. "You know, I'm the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Then you must also know who the true elders of the Overwatch Council are. Xiaoen of the north, Ping of the south." There was a glimmer of bitterness in Haitang's smile. "That director, Chun, has killed countless people in the north. How can we not remember him?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Each has their own master, and each has their own beliefs. The two sides were once enemies. It is natural for you to kill me. I just want you to know that this old man is one of the two people in the world that I cannot see clearly." "Two people?" Haidang turned her head curiously. Correct, Fan Xian said with a cautious expression. With a cautious expression, Fan Xian said, even if it's my emperor or your emperor, I can guess some of their thoughts and positions. Since they sit on the dragon chair, they must think about things related to this chair. However, Chun Ping is different. As they say, having no desires makes one strong, and having tolerance is great. When a person is about to die, his words cannot be pondered. What exactly this old man wants to do and what he is doing, I cannot see clearly. Given his present position, there is absolutely no need for him to be involved in the fight for the throne. Regardless of who becomes the prince, he must be treated well. Furthermore, he has always been so calm. It does not match his way of doing things in his life. Chun Ping was the most famous schemer in the world. For such a person, it was fine if he did not act. Once he did, it would flip the world upside down. Haidang thought for a moment, and then quietly said, if you hadn't avoided me and explained clearly the relationship between your mother and Director Chun, I would certainly have a different view of this matter. Everyone in the world would probably think that Chun Ping's high regard for you is completely because of the Qing Emperor's edict. Correct. Through the things you've told me in the past, I seem to be able to see some unfavorable trends. Haidang smiled self-mockingly. You want to support the third prince. Would Chun Ping want to support you? It is too difficult, Fan Xian said with a frown. There are some problems with my birth. If I don't sweep clean the nobles in the palace, I will not be able to enter the palace. Furthermore, who knows who is hiding behind the events of the past? I will figure this matter out one day. However, I can't rush it right now. As for what you said about the director's intentions, he smiled slightly and shook his head. Being an emperor is not being a commissioner. For such an important matter, if he didn't inform me, he would not dare to do it alone. Haidang sank into deep thought. A moment later, she shook her head and sighed. If I can't figure it out, then don't think about it for now. Jiangnan is only a small fish. Jingdo is the big fish. Fan Xian's eyes were calm as he stared at the two slightly undulating lines on the surface of the lake. After a long time, he said, fishing. I'm still worried whether I've caught a fish or if I've been dragged into the water by the fish and will never be able to climb back up. Haidang smiled and said, you've long gotten your feet wet by the river. Even if you don't want to step into the water, it's impossible. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, that's true. However, there's a sense of uncertainty. I don't like the feeling of having things that are not in my control. No one, not even the ruler of a country, can control everything, Haidang said quietly. I just have to try my best to grasp the bigger picture. That is already good enough. Just now, you said there were two people you had never been able to see through. One was Chun Ping. Who was the other? Haidang was very interested in this question. She knew that Fan Xian was very confident in his ability to read people. He could even grasp certain aspects of the Qing Emperor's thoughts. Yet he admitted there were people he could not see through. She very much wanted to know who the second person was. My father, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, actually, he is the same as Chun Ping. They are both very powerful figures. However, Chun Ping has always been bobbing up and down on the surface of the water, while he has always been at the bottom. Although I am his son, I do not know his true thoughts. Fan Xian treated Chun Ping and Fan Jian as if they were his father. He was sincere and not suspicious. After his mother passed away, he took charge of vengeance. On the night of Jingdo's bloodshed 14 years ago, he cleanly washed the Empress's family in blood. Later, as he grew up, the care and love these two fathers gave him all made Fan Xian feel deep admiration. Strangely, it just so happened that the two people closest to him were the ones he could not see through the most. So, what you've always been worried about is not Jiangnan, but Jingdo, Haidang smiled slightly. With these two unfathomable figures behind you, you indeed do not need to worry about the Jiangnan matter. I'm the whetstone the Emperor has set for those brothers. Fan Xian smiled slightly. This Jiangnan matter, the eldest princess, the crown prince, and the second prince, are they not Whetstone's father and Chun Ping have set for me? The elders all have high hopes for me. I'm very gratified. The word gratified was said with incomparable annoyance. The two thin fishing lines continued to sink steadily into the gentle surface of the water. There was not the slightest tremor caused by the wrist. Haitang glanced at him and said, "Looks like you indeed don't need to use fishing to train your nature." Fan Xian said, "My personality has always been firm and determined. My state of mind is calm. It is difficult for external things to haunt me." For Fan Xian, admitting his good points in front of a woman was not embarrassing to blow his own trumpet. Rather, it was a very good self-analyzing attitude. "Just how old are you now?" Haitang asked curiously. She could not understand how such a young person could suddenly grasp great power in his hands and deal with the complicated affairs of one side and still maintain such a calm state of mind. Fan Xian replied very quickly and asked back, "How old are you this year?" Haitang pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright, making the blue lake in front of her lose its spirit. She refused to answer this question. Fan Xian huffed and said, "I turned 18 on the 8th of the new year." Haitang shook her head mockingly and said, "Looking at the way you usually do things, it's not like no one would believe you if you said you were 80. Old people had experienced the spring wind, summer rain, autumn frost, and winter snow. They had long seen everything in the world. That was why they could use a pair of seemingly indifferent eyes to see through everything in this world. Only because they had experienced it could they look down on it. Only then could they use the calmest state of mind and the most ruthless methods to face those seemingly unusually complicated situations. A necessary foundation for a schemer was that he had fewer desires. Thus, there were fewer openings that could be used by the enemy. Thus, from ancient times until now, those who were famous for scheming were either old men or old women or eunuchs. Young people were always hot-blooded, such as the second prince, the crown prince, and even the eldest princess. Thus, they would sometimes make unwise choices. For someone like Fan Xian, who had the experience of two lives, although he had been given a sorrowful 80-year-old label by Haitang, when he did things, he was indeed as patient as an old man. While using Xia Qifei to fight the family property lawsuit against the Ming family, the rest of the Overwatch Council remained silent. It was not until the storm of the family property lawsuit was about to die down that the Overwatch Council acted. For a moment, many officials of Jiangnan Road were politely invited to the 4th Bureau Inspection Office in Jiangnan Road to drink tea. Everyone knew that the Overwatch Council's tea was authentic Longjing tea. The fragrance of the tea filled the air, but no official wanted to drink it. Although not many of the Jiangnan Road officials were detained for the sake of Governor Xueqing, during the process of drinking tea and chatting, the Overwatch Council would occasionally talk about some old matters that still made the officials tremble in fear. After they returned to their manners, they began to worry about their own futures and personal safety. Correspondingly, the officials who were reminded also noticed that they could no longer protect the Ming family too openly. On the other hand, the Overwatch Council also began to harass the Ming family's business. Although they could not directly seize people and seize goods, using the excuse of investigating Dongyi spies, within a day, the Ming family's shops began to be inspected by the government. The Ming family's fleet also encountered unprecedented trouble while transporting goods. Although the Overwatch Council did not find any major evidence against the Ming family other than a few small crimes of carrying personal goods, under the repeated harassment, they successfully forced the Ming family's favored industrial system to slow down. What the business was particular about was the speed at which goods could be transported and converted into cash. It was like an endless river. Presently, the Overwatch Council was like countless grains of sand slowly sinking into the river. As the flow of the river slowed, the silt also settled down. It was originally a pool of running water, but now it gradually became muddy, making it difficult to move around. The Overwatch Council's actions used the least manpower and aroused the least discussion, but the results achieved were quite good. After the Ming family had paid the palace treasury's large amount of bidding silver, for the first time in many years, they felt their cash flow was stretched thin. Now, they were being harassed by the Overwatch Council. Their cash flow was becoming less and less, and they were forced to transfer silver from Taiping Money House. At the same time, the eldest branch, Ming Qingda, also began to secretly sign a bill of exchange from Zhaoshang Money House. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 380. For many years, the Ming family had lived and multiplied in the Jiangnan area. After decades of careful management and bold expansion by several generations of masters, they finally became one of the largest families in the world. Later, they climbed onto the eldest princess relationship and became a palace treasury royal merchant. Using the endless flow of silver brought by the palace treasury goods, the Ming family's hands and feet extended even further and deeper. Not only did they own countless businesses in Suzhou and Hangzhou, directly controlling large amounts of ships, carriages, and shops, but the family members also indirectly controlled many unremarkable businesses that were deeply connected to the people of Jiangnan. For example, grain, oil mills, brothels. Some people even said that as soon as a Jiangnan person opened their door, they would certainly come into contact with the Ming family's businesses. For such a large family, the factions within the family were unusually complicated. However, the highest power was still held by the 6 sons of the 2 branches of the Ming family. The other, more distant branches were only responsible for managing the middle and lower-level businesses. Because the old Ming matriarch deeply understood the danger of internal divisions in the family, the first arrangement she made after she took sole control of the Ming family was that other than the branch of the eldest branch, Ming Qingda, all of the other 5 Ming children only had the right to receive dividends. They had no power to make any arrangements or suggestions regarding the Ming family's enormous businesses. They were strictly forbidden from participating in the family business. This arrangement was, without question, a wise one. At least it used such a powerful method to ensure the Ming family's unity and good cooperation on the surface. It did not produce the same problems as other families. Until now, the family could still be considered to be unified against outsiders. Although they could not participate in the family business, the other 5 masters received the large dividends from the family every year. They could not hide so much silver under the blankets and give birth to little silver chicks. They had to use it to invest in the outside world. Naturally, they also did a lot of business in Jiangnan. The Ming family used this method to stretch their hands further and further. In the end, the businesses of these branches still had to cling onto the Ming family. If the Ming family fell, the businesses of the 5 masters would also have major problems. Thus, they had to use the power in their hands to protect and escort the eldest branch. Thus, in Fan Xian's eyes, these businesses that did not belong to the Ming family in name still had the Ming surname. Naturally, the Overwatch Council began to harass these businesses equally. This time, the 5 masters could not stand it. They thought to themselves that they did not receive many benefits from the family, and they were still implicated. The more they did business, the more difficult it became. What could they do? Open your dog eyes and look, it's the 4th master in front of you. The 4th master of the Ming family was born of a concubine. His position in the family was not high, so he always liked to walk birds for fun to avoid offending the old matriarch and big brother. Each year, he used the silver he earned to do some business. He opened a vegetable and fruit trading business and did some business that the official fingers missed. Naturally, his days passed very smoothly. But recently, no matter what, he couldn't be happy. The trading company was being investigated every day, and business was slightly declining. Although the results weren't too serious, the bad trend was clear. The officials who usually nodded and bowed in front of him were also rarely willing to drink tea with him. He understood that the Overwatch Council had been frightened by those officials. However, it was not up to the person in front of him to provoke him. A glimmer of viciousness flashed across the 4th master's slightly pale face. He slapped the southern barbarian in front of him until he spun 3 times in place. A red handprint suddenly appeared on his face, and a trickle of blood flowed from the corner of his lips. The fourth master of the Ming family was the largest vegetable and fruit seller in Suzhou. He didn't look like much, but he had a monopoly on 30% of the Jiangnan fruit business. Including the matters of income to the palace, he single-handedly took care of it. There was no problem in calling him the king of melons. Furthermore, he relied on the Ming family's power to establish his own guild and take care of the entire Jiangnan fruit market. In all these years, there had never been a powerful figure who dared to come to his fields to pick some fruits to eat. However, a merchant had suddenly come from Lingnan and jumped over the agreement between the Ming and Xiong families. Without going through the fourth master's hands, he directly sold fruits to Suzhou. Lingnan's weather was hot, and the fruit was beautiful. As long as the problem of long-distance transportation was solved, there would be great profits to be made. If that merchant had understood the rules, he would have first paid his respects to the fourth master after coming to Suzhou. Perhaps the fourth master would have nodded his head and given him some shares to do business. Who knew whether this merchant didn't understand the rules, or if he had something he could rely on? He relied on the fact that he had a lot of goods and a low price to forcefully lower the price of melons in Suzhou and even Jiangnan by 20% within 10 days. This merchant's business also rapidly expanded. The fourth master's face was full of a sinister smile as he stared at the Lingnan merchant he had slapped to the ground. He chuckled and said, "Now who dares to bully the Ming family? A mere southern barbarian. Where did you get the courage?" In reality, he knew that when his family's business began to be suppressed by the Overwatch Council, no matter how useful the Overwatch Council could be, once this kind of news spread and the trend took shape, countless merchant powers that had been suppressed by his family in the past would begin to stir. They would want to take advantage of the Ming family being badly battered, to take advantage of the opportunity to gain some benefits. However, the fourth master could not do anything to Imperial Envoy Fan Xian. He didn't even have the time to be afraid. How could he allow a southern barbarian to mess around on his territory? Use a stick to teach him a lesson. The fourth master looked at the Lingnan melon merchant crying and begging for mercy on the ground. A glimmer of disdain flashed across the corner of his lips. As his voice fell, a wretched cry rang out again from the yard. The fourth master's subordinates held wooden sticks and smashed them viciously toward the Lingnan melon merchant's body. The blows rang out. Who knew how many of the poor merchant's bones had been broken? The wretched cries gradually quieted. His entire body was covered in blood as he was knocked unconscious. To the side, the trusted accountant's heart trembled as he watched this bloody scene. He moved closer and said, "Fourth master, this person should be someone from the Xiong family." "I know," the fourth master said in a severe voice. "Xiong Bailing, that old bastard, wants to use this melon merchant to test us. If I don't retaliate, he will actually think that the Ming family is easy to bully." The accountant smiled bitterly and said, "Fourth master, at this time of year, we can't bring trouble to the family." The fourth master thought of something, and his expression darkened. "The old matriarch is already beginning to suspect me. If I don't act rash right now, what should I do?" Countless complicated emotions welled up in the accountant's heart. He didn't know what to say. The fourth master stood up from his chair and gazed at the blood-covered Lingnan merchant on the ground. In a dark voice, he said, "It's not that I won't let you do business, but doing business is not bullying people. You can't bully me." The Lingnan merchant had already woken up. Hearing these words, he was quite frightened and quickly nodded his head furiously. "Hand over 10,000 liang of silver. At the same time, bring the price back down. Let's compete fairly." The fourth master chuckled. His laughter was incomparably dark and severe. "You won't bully me, so naturally, I won't bully you." After dealing with this person, the fourth master called for people to drag the merchant out. Looking at the bloodstains on the floor, he spat and cursed through gritted teeth. "Fan Xian bullied me, and I didn't retaliate. Who the F***CK is the Xiong family?" Returning to the room, the fourth master washed his hands and rolled up his sleeves. He took down the birdcage from the side of the corridor and began to play with it. He whistled, but his gaze was distant. The accountant followed behind him timidly and said in a low voice, "Fourth master, you're saying The matter of you meeting with Xia Qifei has been found out by the old matriarch? The fourth master's body froze. Suddenly, he cursed angrily. Isn't it all your rotten idea? You said to have a foot in two boats, that the seventh Ming master had survived a great disaster, that he was bound to have good fortune in the future, and that he had the imperial envoy support. The public property would eventually be taken back by him. You wanted me to meet him and speak first. F***CK. The next day, I was called over by the old matriarch to be scolded and almost didn't come out alive. He was incomparably angry. With great difficulty, he calmed the emotions in his chest and coldly said, "The Overwatch Council has been targeting our family recently. If I wasn't more vicious today, how would the old matriarch and big brother see me?" The accountant didn't dare to breathe loudly after being scolded by his master. With a sullen face, he said, "But Master Xiao wanted to meet with you that day, and you had to refuse." Fourth Master, you really don't want to hear what Master Xia said? Seventh brother. The fourth master thought of his younger brother, who had suddenly appeared, and felt it was strange. Concerning the matter of Xia Qifei and his mother being harmed by the old Ming matriarch, he had only occasionally heard about it. He and his mother were clean, so he was not afraid of the other party like the eldest branch. Thinking of the words Xia Qifei had conveyed to the imperial envoy that day, a light flashed through his eyes. He sighed helplessly and said, "I'm afraid of the imperial envoy, but I'm even more afraid of the old matriarch. Furthermore, the Ming family is, after all, our Ming family. If they really listened to you and joined hands with Xia Qifei, with such a terrifying imperial envoy watching from behind, the Ming family would become the court's Ming family." The fourth master smiled wretchedly and said, "No matter how tyrannical the eldest branch is, we have been brothers for so many years. In the end, my surname is still Ming." The accountant didn't dare to continue persuading. The fourth master had officially rejected the good intentions Fan Xian had conveyed through Xia Qifei. Thus, the response from Hua Garden quickly arrived at the large manor he had bought in the south of Suzhou. The Suzhou government bailiffs pushed open the door and entered. Under the watchful gaze of the Ming family thugs, they trembled as they arrived at the Tang family home. They took out the notice and requested that the fourth master follow them back to the Suzhou government for a hearing. The fourth master had not expected that he would also be taken in for questioning. He yelled at the bailiffs in a stern voice, "Are you confused? Who is reporting me? What are you reporting me for?" The bailiffs had no choice. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, how would he dare to offend the true fourth master of the Ming family? Usually, he wished he could kneel on the ground and lick the other's boots. The bailiffs forced a smile and sent a gaze toward the fourth master, indicating that there was someone behind him. He lowered his voice and pleaded, "It is a Lingnan merchant. He is reporting that the fourth master of the Ming family is tyrannizing the market, injuring people, and allowing slaves to commit murder." The fourth master paused and furrowed his brows. He had not thought that the Lingnan merchant would dare to report him. Furthermore, he had not thought that the Suzhou government would accept this case. It had already been many years. The Ming family was special in Jiangnan. The Suzhou government had such a close relationship with the Ming family. How could they accept the Lingnan merchant's complaint? Although the Overwatch Council had recently been playing with the Ming family, the Overwatch Council's biggest problem was that they could not interfere with local government affairs. They also could not directly interfere with civil affairs. The Overwatch Council could not take the lead in such criminal cases. Thus, when he allowed slaves to commit murder earlier, he had not been too worried. However, the Suzhou government had actually sent someone. His gaze passed over the head of the bailiffs and saw an unfamiliar court official standing behind a few officials. Looking at the official's robes, the rank was not high. Furthermore, it did not look like the clothing of the court system. His eyes narrowed and guessed the other party's identity. From a moment, the Lingnan merchant entered the courtyard. All of this had been watched by Overwatch Council officials. No wonder the other party had reacted so quickly. The fourth master's eyelids twitched. He knew he had miscalculated one thing. Although the Overwatch Council could not directly interrogate him, they could keep an eye on the Suzhou government. If the Suzhou government truly ignored him, the Overwatch Council would probably capture the Suzhou government officials and bring them back for questioning. With such a powerful deterrent here, no wonder the Suzhou government dared to capture him today. He laughed coldly and gazed at the bailiffs. So what if I don't go? The bailiffs were so anxious he was about to cry. He pleaded, "Fourth Master, at least give the Zhizhou some face." The Ming family servants all began to clamor. Holding wooden sticks in their hands, they surrounded the bailiffs in the middle. Their cold gazes, intentionally or not, stared at the Overwatch Council official at the back of the crowd. The fourth bureau official of the Overwatch Council smiled slightly and said, "Brothers, what exactly are you planning to do? There seems to be someone here preparing to rebel, beating up officials and not listening to court orders. What was the difference between this and rebellion?" Hearing these words, the Suzhou government official knew that this person had to be captured and brought back today. Otherwise, the Zhizhou would not be able to answer to the Overwatch Council. The Lingnan merchant's wretched state had already been seen by people in the court. Furthermore, people from Hua Garden had also come and were drinking tea in the tea shop opposite the court. None of their actions could be hidden from the imperial envoy's eyes. The official steeled his heart and looked at the fourth master and said, "Fourth Master, please." He used his gaze to endlessly signal to the other party to let him understand that now was not the same as in the past. When it was time to submit first. As for after he was taken into the Suzhou government, naturally, there would be a chance to turn things around. The fourth master lowered his head slightly and muttered to himself for a long time, forcefully suppressing the anger in his heart. He also understood what the situation was and nodded his head. The official let out a big breath and sighed. "Fourth Master, pity me." The young Overwatch Council official of the Fourth Bureau looked at this scene with a cold smile from the back. The accounts master moved closer to the Fourth Master's side and worriedly said, "Fourth Master, what do we do?" The Fourth Master laughed sinisterly and smashed the birdcage in his hand onto the ground, shattering it. Bird feathers flew chaotically, and bird blood splattered everywhere. He smiled coldly and said, "So be it. All these years, I've only had tea in the back garden of the Suzhou government. I haven't had the opportunity to see the true appearance of the Suzhou prison. Today, I'll go and open my eyes." He lowered his voice and hurriedly said, "Immediately send a message back to Ming Garden. Have Big Brother bail me out. Don't worry. The old matriarch will trust me even more because of this matter." After giving his orders, the fourth master of the Ming family was, for the first time in his life, invited back to the prison of the Suzhou government. Looks like fourth brother doesn't have any other intentions. After the news was sent back to Ming Garden, Ming Qingda sent people to open up the channels while he walked into the quiet courtyard his mother lived in. He reported to the old matriarch sitting on the chair, "I'll go and bring him back right now." Although a Lingnan merchant was injured and the Suzhou government is under pressure from the Overwatch Council to bring him back, the matter is not big. There shouldn't be any future trouble. Sir Fan Jr. will not be able to use this matter to bite fourth brother to death. On the chair, the old Ming matriarch sank into silence. Her old and sunken eyes were closed as if she was thinking about something. She still did not reply to Ming Qingda's words. Ming Qingda felt it was strange. A moment later, a chill surged through him. The old Ming matriarch slowly opened her listless eyes and said, "The Ming family is already in a precarious situation. Fourth brother first met with Xia Qi Fei in secret. This is disloyalty. Later, he acted rashly and caused the family to worry about him. This is unfilial. Such a disloyal and unfilial person. Why protect him?" After Ming Qingda's silence, he became sorrowful again. The Ming family's predetermined strategy against Fan Xian's aggressive attacks was to retreat in order to advance and play with sadness. That was why he had knelt in the palace treasury and fallen ill afterward. Presently, the Overwatch Council was threatening fiercely. The Ming family was trembling and appeared very pitiful. However, the old Ming matriarch's intention seemed to be to open an even deeper wound on her family's wound. He took a deep breath and calmly said, "Presently, the situation is still within our grasp. Sir Fan Jr. can only walk on the periphery and cannot hold on to our true weakness. At this time, there is no need to sacrifice so much. After all, he is of the Ming family's blood. The old Ming matriarch glanced at him coldly and emotionlessly. The imperial envoy will push harder and harder. In the end, we will need to sacrifice someone we can bring out in exchange for the sympathy of the Jiangnan people and the inclination of the gentry under heaven. Now that fourth brother has been taken into prison, isn't this the best opportunity? If people know that the imperial envoy forced an old master of the Ming family to death for money, the court will be shocked. We will receive a lot of benefits and time. This transaction is worth it. Ming Qingda's expression did not change. He thought for a moment and then said, "It's all as mother wishes." He knew that his fourth brother was, after all, the concubine's son. In his mother's eyes, he was a dispensable figure. The old Ming matriarch gazed at him coldly and said, "Is the family's cash flow this bad? Why do you often have to transfer money from Zhaoshang recently?" Ming Qingda smiled coldly in his heart and thought, Taiping Money House's seal has always been in your hands. If I want to truly hold the Ming family in my hands, how can I not think of other ways? Although he thought this in his heart, his mouth warmly explained a few things. The old Ming matriarch nodded and finally slowly said, "Only fourth brother is probably not enough for the hearts of the people under heaven to lean toward the Ming family. Qingda, you have to be prepared. Perhaps you will be forced to give up the position of master of the Ming family. Only then will the people under heaven realize the tragic state of the Ming family." Ming Qingda was slightly startled. He bowed deeply and left the room. Outside the courtyard, he smiled slightly at his son, Ming Lanshi, who had been waiting for him the entire time. "Did you hear that? I already said, the one she loves the most is only your sixth uncle. Yesterday, I wrote Fan Xian's birthday incorrectly. My apologies. I'm not in a good mood, so I don't talk much. I also didn't reply to some of my book friends on QQ. Please forgive me." To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 381. Fan Xian did not know what was happening inside the Ming family. For him, the Ming family was a rock. He had to suppress it, but temporarily could not crush it. In any case, he had the patience. There was no rush in fishing. That day, he came to the Suzhou branch of the Baiyue brothel. The business in the brothel had already picked up. The girls upstairs and downstairs were busy receiving customers. Not many people noticed the male owner and female shopkeeper respectfully protecting a person as they quietly went up to the top floor. Pushing open the window and looking out, he saw many workers digging mud to expand the lake. To expand a lake, the amount of money and labor needed was not a small amount. He couldn't resist sighing and asking, "Is there a need?" Sir Chomley smiled slightly and said, "According to Sir's intentions, the plans and layout of the branch were sent urgently to the north. The day before yesterday, the second young master's intention was that this lake is too small and the terrain is not open enough. The customers who come to play will feel a bit cramped, so it is better to put in a lot of effort and dig the lake a few hundred meters forward." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. It looked like Xijia, who was far away in northern Xi, still had Baiyue brothel on his mind. For such a large undertaking, he only had to say one word, yet Fan Xian had to mobilize many people to do it. "There's sound and smell. Aren't you afraid it will affect business? It's surrounded by green cloth. Customers in the building usually won't notice that side. Although business is good right now, if we want to dig the lake, we can only do it now. Otherwise, when spring is at its peak and summer is at its peak, it will be inconvenient to dig at that time." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything. He trusted his brother's business acumen. Today, he had come to Baiyue brothel mainly to find out some information. He looked at the file his subordinate had delivered and furrowed his brows. Where exactly did the Ming family housekeeper escape to? The Ming family housekeeper had the same surname as the housekeeper Fan Xian had beaten in Danzhou when he was a child. They were both surnamed Zhou. This person was not simple. After all these years, he had been the old Ming matriarch's trusted aide and was responsible for managing the accounts of the mysterious Juanshan Conference. After Xiaqi Fei was assassinated by the Juanshan Conference in front of the Jiangnan restaurant, the Overwatch Council had begun to secretly investigate the housekeeper's whereabouts. They were prepared to secretly arrest him at any moment and wanted to obtain some key information from his mouth. However, that housekeeper Zhou seemed to have disappeared within a day and did not appear in any of the Ming family property. No one knew if the Jiangnan road officials were helping him hide or something. In any case, even the Overwatch Council's methods had not been able to find a trace of his whereabouts. Deng Ziyu walked in from outside and reported to Fan Xian the matter of the fourth Ming master being taken into the Suzhou government. Hearing Fan Xian ask about housekeeper Zhou's whereabouts, he couldn't help but furrow his brows. He was responsible for this matter. After so many days without any progress, he also felt ashamed. He furrowed his brows and shook his head. He thought for a moment and said, if he hadn't been silenced by the Ming family, then it should be, there is a high possibility that the other party is openly hiding in the Ming garden, Fan Xian said. Fan Xian knew that if he really wanted to hide the account master of the Juanshan Conference, hiding him in the Ming garden was the riskiest and safest method. He couldn't resist smiling. Do I really have to go into the Ming garden to capture him? Deng Ziyu forced a smile and said, without concrete evidence, how can we enter the palace to capture him? The other party is also someone with a hereditary noble title. Furthermore, if we make the matter too serious, the governor will certainly be forced to open his mouth and pressure you. Fan Xian sighed and felt that this matter was gradually losing its fun. He waved his hand and said, if we charge in and can't capture him, it won't be easy to explain to Xue Qing. If we can confirm that there is someone inside, we can try being barbaric for once. I just can't confirm it, Deng Ziyu said helplessly. The two of them were chatting when suddenly an Overwatch Council spy carefully knocked on the door. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian and walked out the door to say something in a low voice. His expression immediately became serious. He gave a few more reminders in a low voice and then quickly turned around. Leaning close to Fan Xian's ear, he said, there's news from the island. Fan Xian's spirits rose. That damn pirate dock had been quiet for so long. He almost thought that he could no longer use that little island to deal with the Ming family. Hearing that there was news, he said with great interest, speak. Deng Ziyu glanced at him again and carefully said, the people on the island are all dead. Completely dead. With a slap, Fan Xian slammed his palm against the tea table beside him without expression. The tea table did not shatter, nor did the teacup break. However, this slap clearly expressed his dissatisfaction and dissatisfaction. The Ming family had acted ruthlessly and cleanly. He furrowed his brows and asked, where are our people? The Overwatch Council had a spy on the island. Fan Xian was worried about his life and death. Deng Ziyu said, his luck is pretty good. He survived. The Chuanzhou side found their way to the island and just happened to pick him up. Fan Xian's expression was slightly heavy. What is his name? Qinghua. Where is he? Just arrived in Suzhou. He is recovering in a secret residence. Let's go. Qinghua felt that he was dreaming. He had been dreaming these few days. After the island had been surrounded by the soldiers, only he had survived. Surrounded by the sky full of pirate gulls and the ground full of dead bodies, he had tried to find the path his leader had once left behind. He had gone to that hidden little cove and found a boat to go out to sea. He had not thought that the Ming family would be so ruthless in silencing him. All of the boats on the island had been destroyed. Even the three-sail fast boats the pirate leader had hidden had sunk to the bottom of the water. Looking at the sails that had changed color after being soaked in the water, Qinghua felt a bit hopeless. The island was isolated beyond the sea. If the Chuanzhou side discovered that the situation had changed and took the risk to send people to the island again, it would still take a long time. He had been alone on the island without water or food these days. Could he survive? The spies of the 2nd and 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had to undergo harsh wilderness survival training and intelligence gathering training from the beginning of their admission. It was only because of this skill that the single Qing Hua had managed to survive on the island. There was no water on the island. Fortunately, it had rained. There were no wild animals on the island, but there were corpses, there were pirate gulls that ate the corpses, and there were fish and clams in the sea. Thus, he was still strong and disgustingly able to survive. It was not until his colleagues from Chuanzhou took the risk to go to the island again that the extremely weak Qing Hua was finally lifted onto the boat. The boat floated back to the mainland. Qing Hua was finally able to have a good sleep. In his dreams, he thought of the water birds he had eaten and the rotting human flesh in the stomachs of those water islands. Qing Hua still couldn't help but have nightmares. He slept for a long time, from Chuanzhou all the way to Suzhou. When he woke up, he found there was a young and delicate official in front of him looking at him with admiration and pity. The Overwatch Council official beside him reminded him, "It's the commissioner." The commissioner? Qing Hua was startled and struggled to get up and bow. Fan Xian quickly stopped him on the bed and narrowed his eyes slightly. Looking at this Qing Kingdom version of Liu Binshuan, a sigh and admiration welled up in his heart. Political struggles were not treating people to a meal. It was a matter of life and death. However, it was often the lower-level officials who needed to be sacrificed. Fan Xian took out a pill and fed it to him. He then used a golden needle to help him circulate his blood. After carefully treating him for a long time, he confirmed that there wouldn't be too many sequelae and that the other party had enough energy to speak. Only then did he begin to ask questions. In their conversation, Fan Xian obtained a lot of useful information. There is a lot of information that had not been sent ashore in time, such as the connection between the pirate leader and Ming Launcher's concubine. He coldly said, "No wonder that concubine would suddenly return home to visit relatives. I'm afraid she has long sunk into the river to feed the tortoises, marrying a tortoise. In the end, she can only feed the tortoises. She is also a pitiful person. Ziyu, immediately send people to the concubine's home to investigate. I want to see how Ming Lansher is going to explain." Qing Hua had also painstakingly kept a copy of the letter. This was also a very solid piece of evidence. Although the Ming family could still deny it, they could always use this to make an issue of it. "Do you have any thoughts about the soldiers who came to the island?" Fan Xian stared into Qing Hua's eyes and asked. Although he knew that it had not been easy for him to survive on the island, and he had experienced a long journey once on land, and was extremely weak, he had no choice but to ask clearly. This reality was like a thorn in his heart and made him wary. That group of sailors was clearly a helper for the Ming family and had been sent by the eldest princess. Fan Xian wanted to know just who in the military was standing on the eldest princess side. Presumably, the emperor was also very interested in this matter. It cannot be Yin Xiaoyi. Although Yin Xiaoyi was the Qing Kingdom's northern governor with his superior 9th-level status, his military power had always been closely watched by the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian knew that Yin Xiaoyi did not have much power in the Navy. Back then, the Chuanzhou Navy was the strongest naval force of the imperial court. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian and quietly said, "However, after the Yi family matter, in order to clear away the Yi family's influence in the Chuanzhou Navy, the court reduced the Chuanzhou Navy into 3. Presently, the Jiangnan Navy's nominally main yamen is in Shazhou. You should have met with the officials there. To enter the sea from Shazhou and land on the island to kill people, the distance is too far. Furthermore, the voyage is all on the Yangtze River. It is easy to reveal traces. In my opinion, it shouldn't be them." Fan Xian nodded. He did not have any emotional fluctuations because of the words Yi family. He turned his head to look at Qing Hua. On the bed, Qing Hua's lips had white bubbles forming on them. He was also trying hard to remember the soldier who had landed on the island that night. He knew this matter was very important and could allow the council to determine just who dared to be in cahoots with the pirates. With great difficulty, he opened his mouth and said, "When the official ship landed on the island, it was just before dawn. There were many reefs around the island. Under such a dark sky, to be able to forcefully land on the island, it should be a professional navy and not a soldier on shore borrowing a ship. I once saw the face of a soldier clearly. Looking at the contours of his face, he should be someone from the north. Fan Xian's brows furrowed. Could it be Dong Yi's navy? Qinghua shook his head with difficulty and reported. They occasionally opened their mouths to speak, but it was not a Dong Yi accent. Fan Xian gazed at Deng Ziyu and saw the glimmer of unease in each other's hearts. The Qing kingdom had 3 great navies. In the north was the Jiaozhou Navy, stationed near Shandong Road, and had great power. If the other party was a capable general on the eldest princess side, then the power the eldest princess held in the military was much more powerful than they had previously imagined. In Fan Xian's heart, since the emperor had always been stingy in letting him hold a sliver of military power and had always appeared so confident and arrogant, he believed that the majority of the power of the Qing kingdom's military was in the emperor's hands. Under such a premise, Fan Xian would have more confidence when he did things. Now, he had suddenly discovered that the eldest princess and the prince's power had increased by leaps and bounds. How could Fan Xian not be wary? The Yi family would gradually lean toward the second prince, the northern governor Yin Xiaoi, and now there was another navy. Whose people are the Jiaozhou Navy? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Deng Ziyu lowered his voice and said, The admiral of the navy is a first-level military general. Naturally, he doesn't have to listen to Yin Xiaoi's orders. I've never felt that he has any inclinations. After all, he comes from the Qin family, but his relationship with Yi Zhong's faction is not bad. Fan Xian gently tightened his fist and shook his head. He didn't say anything more. Looking at the tired Qinghua on the bed, a faint smile rose to his face. Recover well. After you recover, follow me and do things. He greatly admired this young Overwatch Council official who was able to hide on the pirate island and successfully survive. Such an outstanding talent should become his trusted aide. Qinghua was shocked. He had not expected that after his narrow escape, he would have such good luck. For a moment, he froze on the bed, not knowing what to say. It was not until Fan Xian led the Qinian unit out of the room and the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council's Inspection Division stationed, and Xuanzhou smiled and congratulated him that he came to his senses. He knew he had finally made it. The nightmare had finally woken up. Fan Xian was a bit angry. Everything he had encountered today was not good news. It looked like he had to quickly send the council report back to Jingdou and have the old cripple be more spirited and not always stay in Chun Garden looking at beautiful women. If your successor ran into a problem, you had to solve it, right? Sir, there's good news. Just as Fan Xian was silently cursing his bad luck, Deng Ziyu suppressed a glimmer of joy and respectfully reported. What news? That accountant of the Juanshan conference. We have the whereabouts of him. Where is he? Sir is wise. The news is accurate. That person is in Ming Garden. Fan Xian pressed his palms together and sighed. Finally, there's something to do. Not in a good mood. Not in a good state. Right, Les? If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 382. In the middle of April, the feeling of spring was bright and beautiful. All of Jiangnan was enveloped in a warm wind. The people walking on the streets were already beginning to only wear lined clothes. Outside Jingdou, thousands of miles away from Suzhou, one could still see the patch of white snow on top of the Tsang Mountain from a long distance. It was as cold as the white cloth covering the face of corpse. The tall man wearing the straw hat withdrew his gaze from the white snow on top of the Tsang Mountain and silently drank the remaining tea in his cup. He ordered a bowl of plain noodles and began to eat without much taste. This place was 30 li outside of Jingdou. It was called Sherpai Village. This tall man wearing the straw hat was the second priest of the Qing temple who had traveled with great difficulty from Jiangnan to Jingdou, Great Master Sanshur. Great Master Sanshur had not come to the capital to discuss the Tao or to pluck the willows outside the imperial road. He had come to kill. He had come to assassinate the emperor. Although Fan Xian had intentionally or unintentionally let him leave in Jiangnan, the Overwatch Council's investigation was strict. Even though the Northwest Road had not been heavily guarded, It still took Sanshur a great deal of time to get around the Overwatch Council and Black Knight's blockade and come to Jingdo. The Juanshan Conference was indeed a loose organization. However, once this organization possessed an unusually sacred and important mission, its importance became apparent. Not many people knew just how many important figures of the powers in the world were gathered by this mysterious organization. Although Great Master Sanshur was honored as the second priest of the Qing Temple, he did not have much power to speak in the Juanshan Conference. Furthermore, he was personally opposed to the Juanshan Conference's arrangements in Jiangnan. After his unsuccessful attempts to interfere with Fan Xian's administration, Great Master Sanshur made himself a sacrificial pawn and broke away from the Juanshan Conference's arrangements. Alone with great ambitions and a red sun hidden in his heart, he proudly headed to Jingdo. He was going to Jingdo to kill people that could not be killed. As he thought this, he silently ate his noodles. Following his elder brother's earnest teachings, he chewed each noodle carefully and slowly until it became a paste. Only then did he swallow it with satisfaction. For some reason, Great Master Sanshur ate with sorrow and found it difficult to control himself. 2 muddy tears slid down from his old eyes and dripped into the noodle soup. He was going to enter the capital to ask the emperor why. After finishing the noodles, he put on the bamboo hat to cover his face. He picked up the wooden staff that was as tall as a person and left the noodle shop. Following the small path at the foot of Shirpai village, he began to walk in the direction of the capital. In front of them was the dark imperial city, and behind them was the pure white mountain. The ascetic monks were walking in the middle. The forest grew deeper and the road narrower. It was still early, so there were no woodcutters diligently getting up to chop firewood. It was also impossible for any pedestrians to pass by in the wilderness. The mountain road was quiet, so quiet that it was a little strange. There was not even the sound of birds or insects. After all, Great Master Sanshur was not a warrior skilled in assassination. He was just an ascetic monk with a very high cultivation. Although he felt it was a little strange, he did not pay it much attention. The court and the Juanshan Conference should not know that he had come from Jiangnan to Jingdo. The only person who knew of this matter was the northern Qi Saint girl, Haitang. No matter how one looked at it, it was impossible for Haitang to reveal his whereabouts. Great Master Sanshur believed this very much. He did not think that anyone would know his path in advance and set up an ambush ahead of time. Thus, when that mournful and deadly arrow shot out of the dense forest and viciously pierced into his eye socket, Great Master Sanshur felt very surprised. The way the arrow flew was very strange. At the beginning, it was silent, like a ghost or a demon. Only when it was only 3 feet away from his face did it suddenly let out a shrill whistle. The whistling sound of the arrow was enough to take away one's soul, incomparably terrifying. Hiss! Roar! The long black arrow seemed to cry out the word kill. Great Master Sanshur gave a muffled grunt. His long wooden staff stabbed viciously into the ground. The head of the staff, carved into the shape of a bird's head, stretched forward in a very short time and blocked the arrow that seemed to have flown from the sky. With a muffled sound, the arrow shot viciously into the head of the wooden staff. The boundless power contained in the arrow shook Great Master Sanshur's wrist slightly. In an instant, the bird's head carved on the head of the staff exploded. Great Master Sanshur narrowed his eyes. A chill rose in his heart. It seemed that only the governor of the north, Yan Xiaoi, had such a lightning-fast archery skill. Yan Xiaoi should be in Sangzhou at this time, thousands of li from Jingdo. Separated by the leaves in the forest, Great Master Sanshur's clear eyes saw clearly the archer's face. It was a young and unfamiliar face. He knew that the arrow he had personally received must have been taught by Yan Xiaoi. This unfamiliar young man must be Yan Xiaoi's disciple. While he was thinking of these things, Great Master Sanshur had already used the rebound of the staff to fly into the air. Like a large bird, he spread his body. Holding the wooden staff in his hand, he smashed it like a mad demon. Although he didn't know why the other person wanted to kill him, before he entered Jingdo and asked the emperor that question, he would not allow himself to die. Great Master Sansher's figure was tall and sturdy. He wore a straw hat on his head. His staff was full of murderous intent. His entire body floated in the air like a vicious large bird, filled with an aura of no return. When fighting against a godly archer, the most important thing was to close the distance between them. However, leaping into the air and exposing all of one's openings to the opponent, and one had nowhere to borrow strength from the air, it was even more difficult to dodge those ghostly arrows. Great Master Sansher swept over and looked at the archer's calm face. He knew that the other party wanted to take the opportunity to shoot. As expected, the archer didn't know how to move. His hands flashed, and he had already taken out an arrow from behind him, knocked it, took aim, and fired. These were 3 simple actions, but they were completed naturally, harmoniously, and quickly. It was as if they were inseparable actions. It was very beautiful. This kind of simple beauty came from his daily hard practice and talent in archery. With a whoosh, the second arrow shot toward Great Master Sansher's throat. At this moment, he was in the air and had no way of dodging such a swift arrow. However, Sansher had been waiting for this moment. He gave a muffled grunt and did not dodge. He circulated his junshi to his abdomen and used his stupidest and most powerful iron shirt to forcefully block this arrow. The arrow hit his throat and made a strange gurgling sound. A strange light flashed through Great Master Sansher's eyes. His entire body had already charged toward the archer and struck out with his staff. At this moment, there was only 3 feet between the two of them. How could the archer dodge? The archer's expression was still calm. Facing the crazed staff, he steadily took 2 steps back. Holding his longbow in front of his body, he spat out one word from his mouth, seal. For golden knives came out of nowhere and turned into 4 streams of light, sealing Great Master Sansher's killing blow. A loud explosion rang out. The knives shattered, the staff was in chaos, and a cloud of dust filled the forest. Amidst the dust filling the air, the sound of an arrow rang out again. A soul-stealing arrow pierced through the dust and the forest. In a very short distance, it once again shot toward Great Master Sansher's throat. The distance was too close. Great Master Sansher had no time to dodge, and he didn't dare let his weakest throat be continuously tested by the Yin family's archery skills. Thus, he raised his palm and took a saluting posture. The other party had used 4 knives to seal his staff, so he would use 1 palm to seal this arrow. That slender, soul-eating arrow nailed itself to the edge of Great Master Sansher's thick and calloused palm. It was like a mosquito staring at a pitiful person's flesh. It swayed a few times before landing on the ground. It was only a very light sting, a nail. Great Master Sansher's body began to sway violently. He was shaken by this arrow and took a step back. Another arrow arrived. Great Master Sansher raised his palm again, sealed, and retreated again. The arrows shooting out of the dust grew faster and faster. It was as if they would never stop. Who knew what kind of terrifying hand speed the archer behind the dust had? If so, there were 9 arrows. Great Master Sansher was shaken back 9 steps and forced back to the side of the mountain path by those terrifying arrows. He gave a muffled grunt, and Jinshi flowed through his arms. With a wave of his long staff, he sent the last arrow flying. Then, he felt his feet tighten. A terrifying animal trap made a gurgling sound and clamped down on his right foot. This animal trap was so big that it was probably used to trap tigers. Even though Great Master Sansher had the unbreakable power of the iron shirt, suddenly encountering a trap, the flesh on his calf still split open and blood spurted out. Great Master Sansher let out a pained cry. He furrowed his unwilling brows tightly. There was also a small spot of blood on his throat. The hand holding the wooden staff also had many small spots of blood slowly seeping out. With so many unpredictable and sharp arrows, if it had been anyone else, they would have long been shot into a porcupine. Only he had not suffered any true injuries. Unfortunately, in the end, he was still forced into the trap by these arrows. The dust gradually settled. In the opposite forest, the face of the young archer once again appeared, along with four knife-wielding men. Great Master Sanshur looked coldly at the other party and said, "I didn't think it would be you who killed." Before he finished speaking, the young archer had come to silence him and had no interest in conversing with Great Master Sanshur. Although he knew that Great Master Sanshur was also a legendary figure, the younger generation had grown up and did not have much reverence in their hearts. The young man used the steady fingers of his right hand to place the poisoned arrow on the bowstring. Once again, he aimed at the throat of the immobile Great Master Sanshur. "Shoot!" As he spoke, the arrow in his hand did not leave the bowstring. The forest was in chaos. Countless archers surged out from all directions. Separated by a distance of dozens of feet, they surrounded Sanshur in the center. They all held bows and arrows in their hands. Following the word "shoot," countless long arrows left the bowstring. They transformed into soul-stealing straight lines and viciously pierced toward Great Master Sanshur's body in the center. Sanshur's pupils constricted slightly. Looking at the other party's arrangement, he knew that he might not survive today. To be able to arrange so many archers in the mountain, they must be people from the military. No matter how powerful an ace, when faced with the merciless and cold-blooded attacks of the military, they would not be able to survive. Furthermore, his right foot had already been caught in that hateful beast trap. He was not Yiluyan or Kuhi. Great Master Sanshur sighed in his heart and waved the long staff in his hand, blocking the rain of arrows coming from all directions. Clang, 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 countless shattering sounds rang out around his body. In just a moment, hundreds of flying arrows had been shattered by his wooden staff. The broken arrows piled up around his body. It looked unusually sad. Some arrows pierced through his defensive circle and stuck into his body. However, these archers were not as good as the young man earlier and were unable to pierce through Great Master Sanshur's iron shirt. The leading young archer was not in a hurry. He only looked coldly at Great Master Sanshur, who was struggling like a dying beast. He watched this ascetic monk helplessly fight against the sky full of arrows. He knew that the other party's Jinchi was strong. If he wanted to kill him from a distance, he needed to be patient and continue to waste time. As long as Sanshur's Jinchi showed the slightest sign of waning, he would not be able to maintain his ability to stab. Once the arrows entered his body, that would be the time of Sanshur's death. Thus, he only aimed at Sanshur's throat and coldly waited for that moment. The dozens of archers in the forest only coldly and endlessly shot arrows. Sanshur howled loudly and endlessly waved his wooden staff, struggling in the rain of arrows. Eventually, there would come a time when his strength was exhausted. At this moment, Sanshur's bravery and might looked so sad. Faced with powerful military machines, what use was a martial ace? What a cruel scene it was. The merciless shooting continued. The broken arrows piled higher and higher in Great Master Sanshur's body. Gradually, they went past his calf and completely submerged the animal trap and injured leg in the arrows. It looked like a self-immolating monk who was endlessly chopping at the pile of firewood that was about to ignite himself. Great Master Sanshur's clothes were already soaked with sweat. The speed at which he waved his wooden staff had also slowed. It was clear that his Jinchi was not as abundant as before. It was this opportunity that the leading archer, who had been waiting for a long time, gently released his middle finger. The arrow on the bowstring shot out. With a swoosh, the entire forest and the entire world seemed to have quieted down in an instant. Great Master Sanshur held the arrow in his throat. His mouth made gurgling sounds, but he could no longer say anything. Fresh blood flowed out of his palm. The archers around him also stopped shooting. The young archer furrowed his brows and coldly and emotionlessly said, "Continue." The power of the arrows rose again. In an instant, Sanshur's body was pierced by a dozen arrows. Fresh blood dyed his entire body red. Sanshur slowly closed his eyes and sighed again in his heart. He knew that showing weakness to lure the enemy was not feasible. When Yin Xiaoyi's disciple did things, he indeed had the cold and emotionless style of his teacher. He waved his hand, and his large sleeve brushed away a number of arrows. His eyes opened, and a bright light flashed. With an explosive roar, the wooden staff he had been holding in his hand split open from the outside by this pure qi. Pieces of wood flew in all directions, revealing the knife inside. In Suzhou, Sanshi had once used one knife to cut through a long street. At this moment, his knife could only cut toward himself. Slashing down diagonally, the edge of the knife entered the flesh without a sound. He ruthlessly chopped off his right calf. He would no longer be trapped in the animal trap. Sanshi was like a large bird with broken wings. Once again, he ruthlessly flew into the air. Like a goshawk hunting a rabbit, he killed his way into the enemy ranks. The knife light splashed like snow, causing people to spray blood. In one exchange, he cut off 3 heads and broke open the chests of a number of people. The forest was a scene of bloody slaughter. What a tyrannical knife! When Sanshi struck, the cold young archer had already turned and left. Silently, he climbed up a tree and began to shoot arrow after arrow. He knew that the other party was already at the end of his strength. He had also cut off his own leg, and blood flowed freely. The other party wouldn't be able to hold out for much longer. As expected, after the knife light dazzled for a moment, it gradually dimmed. After killing a ground full of archers, the poison in Sanshi's body flared up. His injuries flared up, and he ran out of blood. Dropping the hilt of his long knife to the ground, he gave a muffled grunt and spat out his last breath. The second priest of the Qing temple was dead. After confirming Sanshi's death, the archers surrounded him. They were all elites of the military. They had come to surround and kill, and even shamelessly murder, the second priest of the Qing temple. Not everyone could maintain their calm on the surface, particularly after the other party had fallen into their trap and was still able to cut off his own leg and kill so many of their brothers. When these people thought back to it, they couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts. "Clean it up. You all return to camp," the young archer said coldly. "Ding Han, you're in charge of cleaning up." A soldier bowed in a low voice in acknowledgement. The woods once again returned to peace. The soldiers who were good at shooting took off their disguises and found another secret place to change and return to camp. After exiting the woods, the young archer had already changed into a commoner's clothing. He did not follow the group back to camp. Instead, he turned left and right out of the woods and found the official road back to the capital. On the way, he hitched a ride in a carriage. Along the way, he chatted and laughed with the merchant as he entered Jingdou. After entering Jingdou, the archer first ate 2 bowls of vegetable porridge and then bought a paper windmill on the side of the street. He passed through the main street in the south of the city and walked through a secluded alley. Stopping at the door of a storytelling hall, he seemed to not be able to resist the temptation of the storybooks. He entered the building and asked for a cup of tea and a plate of melon seeds. He then began to listen. After listening for a while, he seemed to have the urge to pee and went to the bathroom. Behind the bathroom, he exited the courtyard wall. After confirming that no one was following him, he entered a manor. He didn't know whose family this manor belonged to. He walked as easily and freely as if he were in his own home. Entering the study, he knelt in front of the desk and reported to the pair of small and delicate feet under the table. "Your Highness, it has been eliminated. You've worked hard." The eldest princess of Qing Kingdom, Li Yunrui, smiled slightly. When this woman, who was so beautiful that she did not seem mortal, smiled, it added a sense of charm. When the young archer killed Great Master Sanshi, he appeared cold and heartless. At this moment, he did not dare meet the eldest princess's eyes. After rising, he stood obediently to the side. "Sanshi, what a pity." The eldest princess sighed with great regret. "He didn't listen to my words and insisted on imitating the bravery of an ignorant man. At this time, how could we make the emperor suspicious of us? Everything is not ready. Now is not the time to act. For someone like him who doesn't listen, we can only let him go." The young archer remained silent and did not say a word. He knew that these major matters should be the concerns of the elders. He only needed to carry them out. The eldest princess glanced at him and said with a slight smile, "You can't follow Governor Yin into battle in the north. Do you have any complaints?" The young archer smiled and said, "Father only drinks all day in the north. How can it compare to the excitement of the capital?" After saying a few more words, the eldest princess allowed him to leave the study. This manor was nameless. No one knew that the eldest princess would occasionally come here. She liked to sit alone in this study and think about things. She would often think about herself until she was crazy. Juanshan Conference? A self-mocking smile rose to the corners of her lips. When she was young, what was her goal in organizing the Juanshan Conference? It was to do something for the Qing kingdom. It was to help her brother the emperor do things that he found inconvenient, such as killing an official or stealing someone's property. Although her brother the emperor had never known of the existence of the Juanshan Conference, the Juanshan Conference had helped him a great deal in secret, such as the battle with Northern Qi and the secret influence on Dongyi. But when did such a huge change happen? The purpose of the Juanshan Conference had undergone such a great change in her hands. A glimmer of misery flashed across the eldest princess's face. She thought of Fan Xian far away in Jiangnan, the palace treasury, the Overwatch Council, and the suspicions and inclinations the emperor had shown these 2 years. "I gave the emperor a pearl. What did the emperor give me?" She closed her eyes and then opened them again. Her gaze had already recovered its calm. She smiled slightly and thought, "Since the emperor does not accept me, I should cherish myself." It was not impossible to pay a price for this. Sir Yuan's words did indeed have his reasons. It was still the same patch of forest. Other than the faint smell of blood, there was no trace of a previous attack. It looked like the military's handling of the scene was no worse than the Overwatch Council's. Everyone had already left. Ding Han, who had been left behind by Yin Xiaoyi's son to take care of the aftermath, was the last to leave the forest. Strangely, not long after he left, he silently returned to the forest. Under a pile of mud, he found a broken arrow that he had purposely hidden earlier and carefully tucked it into his clothes. Following this, he spat on his hands and began to dig with great difficulty. After digging for an indeterminable amount of time, he finally reached a very deep place and dug out the bodies that had already been burned beyond recognition. After confirming that it was Sansher's body, he pulled out a dagger from his boot and inserted it into the neck bone of the body. Very carefully, he chopped off Great Master Sansher's head. He refilled the soil, scattered leaves, and spread moss. After confirming that there were no problems, this person called Ding Han sighed with satisfaction and turned to leave the forest. He didn't need to enter Jingdo, because the place he was going was outside Jingdo. In the back mountain of Chung Garden, the back door, the wooden arch, and the old servant. The old servant accepted a box and a package from his hands. Ding Han silently bowed and began to return to the camp. In a dark and cold room, Chun Pingping sat in a wheelchair and looked with a slight smile at the charred head on the cloth. "Do you think it's already been burned to this extent? Will the emperor still be able to recognize that idiot Sansher?" The old servant chuckled and couldn't say anything. He only saw that the old master seemed to be happy, so he was also happy. Chun Pingping once again took out the broken arrow from the box and looked at it with narrowed eyes for a while. Suddenly, in a sharp voice, he said, "Sansher is an idiot. Do you think the eldest princess is also an idiot?" She could have used anyone, but she used Yin Xiaoyi's son. Admittedly, she can tie Yin Xiaoyi tighter, but it would also be easy for her to be exposed. No? It was clear that this director of the Overwatch Council did not think much of the scheming ability of the younger generation. He used his withered hands to gently stroke the wool blanket on his knees and shook his head. In this world, there are always some people who think that there are some things that no one will ever know, such as that bullshit Juanshan Conference. The old servant quietly said, "Are we going to enter the palace?" "Yes." The commissioner's side seems to be a bit difficult to make a move. The old servant had been Chun Pingping's trusted aide and housekeeper for 20 years. He knew most of the director's thoughts and carefully reminded him. Chun Pingping sank into silence. A moment later, he said, Fan Xian might still act too early, but let him do it. Let him do what he thinks is right. As for the things he might not want to do, I'll do it. There were many things that Qin Pingping would never tell Fan Xian because he knew that Fan Xian's heart was far from being as hard and strong as his. He pushed the wheelchair to the window. In the distance came the faint sounds of laughter from the beautiful women the old man had collected. He looked outside and thought of Yuan, who had always been by the eldest princess's side. He couldn't resist smiling innocently like a child. Often, the things that enemies don't want me to know, I actually know, but a glimmer of self-mockery flashed through the old man's eyes. He sighed and said, "Sometimes, being a person who knows everything is not a happy thing." The old servant gently massaged his shoulders. He knew that tomorrow, the director would bring the head and the broken arrow into the palace. The Juanshan conference would appear in front of the emperor for the first time, and the emperor would finally make up his mind. What the director needed was for the emperor to make up his mind. Qin Pingping slowly lowered his head. If he didn't stir up some big trouble and kill a few nobles in the palace, how could he be willing to let go and die? Chapter 383. The emperor was not in a good mood. Everyone in the palace and court knew that the emperor had not been in a good mood these few days. The emperor had even stopped his regular program of watching plays with the Empress Dowager every 10 days. Other than the daily court conferences, not many people had the opportunity to see the emperor. Eunuch Yao, Eunuch Ho, and the now reinstated Eunuch Dai had been surrounded by officials outside the palace every day. Everyone wanted to know exactly what had happened. The emperor also did not summon his trusted officials into the palace. Looking at it, it did not seem that he was worried about something. Everyone knew that the emperor was not in a good mood. In the court conference, most of the memorials from various provinces had been rejected. The official of the Supreme Court had been harshly scolded. Old Qin of the Bureau of Military Affairs had also been scolded by the emperor. The Qin family was the emperor's most trusted aide and an important official in the military. Under normal circumstances, the emperor would always leave the Qin family some face in front of the civil and military officials. Now, he had treated them harshly. The expressions of the Jingdo garrison Qin Hung and General Qin did not change. When they entered and left the Hall of Governmental Affairs, they still maintained their bright smiles. It looked like they did not care much about the emperor's scolding of their family. Seeing this, the officials understood that the emperor was using the scolding of his trusted aide to remind some other people in the capital. This was a very chaotic method. No one could guess who the emperor wanted to remind, but they knew that the matter of reminding already existed. As expected, on the third day, Yizhong, Faraway, and Dingzhou once again sent a pain memorial to the emperor saying that now that the world was at peace, there was no longer a need for Dingzhou to maintain too many military forces and that some people should be dismissed. Asking to be dismissed was the Yi family's fearful stance. The emperor lightly allowed it. He did not allow the court conference or the Bureau of Military Affairs to debate this matter. The officials, including the newly appointed Hu the Scholar and Shu the Scholar, all thought this was a follow-up to last year's Hanging Temple incident and did not think of anything else. After the Yi family asked to be dismissed, the emperor's mood seemed to improve slightly. He resumed his daily greetings to the Empress Dowager. At the same time, he allowed the eldest princess to once again live in the palace. Guangxin Palace once again truly opened its doors for the eldest princess. Distance made beauty, but it also made danger. A family living together would certainly be much safer. This was probably what the emperor thought, the old man in the Qin garden thought. He sighed, knowing that things did not go according to his plan. He still needed to do something. However, since the seeds had begun to sprout, under the cultivation of the black soil in people's hearts, there would be a day when poisonous vines would grow and break through the layer of hard rock that was pressing on it. Only the people who lived in the palace knew that the emperor's mood had not truly improved. His face still carried a trace of worry and slight sadness. The emperor was the master of the world and the master of the palace. He was the object that everyone needed to look at. He was the object that everyone entrusted their lives to. He was the hope of everyone's future and wealth. Thus, Everyone in the palace was carefully and nervously guessing what other thoughts the emperor was hiding in his heart. The few old eunuchs who served in Taiji Palace and the royal study had long become shrewd people. Of course, they refused to make a sound when the various palaces probed. Furthermore, under Eunuch Hong's accumulated power, the nannies and eunuchs of the various palaces did not dare to ask too obviously. After the eldest princess moved gloomily into Guangxin Palace, she immediately recovered her usual beautiful appearance. Every day, she went to the Empress Dowager's side to chat with her. Occasionally, she would go to the Eastern Palace to see the Empress and Crown Prince. However, she herself was a bit confused. She didn't know what exactly the emperor was thinking. At this time, a head eunuch in the Eastern Palace became a very important figure. He was called Hong Zhu and had always worked at the emperor's side. He was deeply liked by the emperor. Furthermore, it was rumored that he had some sort of relative relationship with Eunuch Hong. He was also familiar with the people in Taiji Palace and the royal study. If such a person was sent to scout for information, he should be the most suitable candidate. Hong Zhu had already been the head of fourth-level eunuchs in the Eastern Palace for 3 months. Relying on the identity that the emperor had sent and his own careful and appropriate service, he had already received the empress' approval. Of course, he could not immediately be accepted. However, the empress had also given Hong Zhu enough benefits. She also wanted to see whether or not Hong Zhu could be used and to what extent he could be used. The empress smiled slightly as she looked at Hong Zhu kneeling in front of her. She somewhat liked this little eunuch's knowledge and tactfulness. His features were delicate and pretty. In a quiet voice, she said, "The emperor is worried about national affairs. Naturally, I also want to share the emperor's burden. Although the back palace cannot recklessly interfere in national affairs, knowing the emperor's mood can make some soup for him to make the emperor more comfortable." Hong Zhu flatteringly said, "The empress has thought of everything. Go ask the empress side." The empress sighed and said, "If His Majesty finds out, there is no need to hide it." Presently, the crown prince's body was much better than it had been 2 years ago. At least, much of the unhealthy whiteness on his face had faded. This was, of course, because of the emperor's strict discipline and not allowing him to waste too much energy on matters between men and women. It was also because he was gradually growing older and faced with complicated situations, as well as the pressure of his royal brother step by step. This was a change he had no choice but to make. For the crown prince, in the past, his greatest enemy was the second prince. However, after the second prince was successfully beaten half of his body by Fan Xian, he suddenly discovered that Fan Xian, who he had thought was his greatest help, was actually also his father's son. Furthermore, he was the son of his father and that demoness. For the Eastern Palace, there had long been an unresolvable grudge with the Yi family. Thus, the crown prince was most wary of Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan. Everyone knew that after Fan Xian's past was revealed, if the crown prince took the throne, Fan Xian would certainly not have a good end. If Fan Xian held power alone, he would certainly not allow the crown prince to take the throne. "Mother, it seems that we can act on the matter of the Ministry of Revenue," the crown prince said as he listened to the empress and Hong Zhu's conversation from behind the screen. The empress closed her eyes and thought for a moment. She then said, "How trustworthy is this eunuch Hong Zhu?" 70%. The empress smiled slightly and said, "I also think so. Hong Zhu was originally an errand boy in the royal study at your father's side. His meteoric rise was just around the corner. Although he has been moved to the Eastern Palace and has risen 2 ranks to become the head eunuch, his power is far less than it was before." The crown prince said, if Fan Xian had not reported the matter of Hong Zhu asking for bribes to father would not have angrily chased Hong Zhu out. Everyone in the palace knew about this matter. They all knew the story of that day in the royal study. They all thought that the reason Hong Zhu left the royal study was because he had offended the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. The empress sighed and said, "Let's see how the emperor deals with it. He truly likes Hong Zhu, that little eunuch. The problem is, I am not sure if this matter is true or false." The crown prince furrowed his brows in deep thought and said, "It should be true that Hongzhu holds a grudge against Fan Xian. The eunuchs and serving girls in the palace have all heard him speak of this matter through gritted teeth. As for father, even if he uses Hongzhu to monitor me, I have not made any mistakes in this half a year." The empress nodded. A murderous intent flashed through her phoenix eyes. She smiled coldly and said, "As long as the reason for the emperor's anger is true, the matter of the Ministry of Revenue can be investigated. Fan Jian cannot remain in the Ministry of Revenue. Otherwise, with Fan Xian in charge of the palace treasury in Jiangnan and Fan Jian in charge of the national treasury in Jingdou, your future days will be difficult." The crown prince nodded and replied, "I will always remember father's teachings and only do what father wishes to do." The empress furrowed her brows and said, "In a moment, I will go to Guangxin Palace and ask for your aunt's opinion." Suddenly hearing the eldest princess name, a strange light flashed through the crown prince's eyes. He immediately hid it well and said hesitantly, "Should we ask my aunt's side to step in?" The empress shook her head and smiled coldly. She's also not easy to get along with. Besides, now that the emperor has her live in the palace, isn't it also with the intention of monitoring her closely? If she is deep in the palace, it will not be easy for her to communicate with the officials in court. Although the way your father does things often looks simple, he is actually very clever. You have to learn more in this area. It has been very difficult for your aunt to move around recently. The nominal mother of the country sighed, but there was a sense of schadenfreude that could not be hidden between her brows. The eldest princess was too dazzling among the women of the Qing kingdom and had always faintly overshadowed the empress' elegance. How could she be happy now that her husband was becoming more and more displeased with her sister-in-law? Although logically, the empress knew it was not a good thing, emotionally, she still couldn't help but feel a glimmer of joy. That shameless little vixen. I'm just going to let her know. The empress sighed and patted the crown prince's shoulder. For now, you have to endure the relationship between your aunt and the second prince. Don't remember what happened in the past. As for the matter of investigating the deficit in the Ministry of Revenue this time, I will find someone to do it, don't worry. A faint coldness surged between her brows. Although Mother's paternal family has been completely wiped out by those wretched people, there are still some people hidden in court. As for Fan Jian, did he think he could hide it from the people of the world by moving so much silver from the national treasury to Jiangnan? Did he think he could hide it from the emperor? No matter how much the emperor likes Fan Xian, he would not allow this kind of thing to happen under his eyes. The crown prince was slightly shocked. No wonder the deficit in the Ministry of Revenue was so great. Fan Jian was so daring. Only now did he know that his mother and aunt had long grasped the root of the Ministry of Revenue's problem. No wonder they were so confident. The empress smiled slightly and said, "After the Ministry of Revenue, the world will be peaceful for a few more days. Fan Xian will not be able to be as lively as he is now. Think about it carefully. In the emperor's heart, as long as you don't do anything out of line, even if you fight with those people, he will just pretend he didn't see it. In the end, you are still the crown prince. This is something everyone knows." The crown prince sighed. Throughout the history of dynasties, perhaps only I, the crown prince, have been the most useless. The empress smiled coldly and said, "Who knows how many crown princes in history lived worse than you before they took the throne? What are you afraid of? As long as you endure until the day you take the throne, there will be times when you can hold your head high." She continued coldly, "Mother has concluded that the emperor still wholeheartedly wants you to succeed the throne. Naturally, I have my reasons." The crown prince anxiously said, "But although the second prince has fallen, the third prince has gone down to Jiangnan and has always been taken by Fan Xian. This was the matter that had been discussed the most in the palace recently. The third prince was young, yet he had followed the imperial envoy down to Jiangnan to oversee affairs. It was called learning, but was it to learn how to rule a country? Thus, the third prince's birth mother, Yi Pin, became the center of the discussion. However, this woman of the Liu family remained silent and reserved. The Empress glared at the crown prince and gritted her teeth. You're even so afraid of an ignorant child. What kind of future do you have? The crown prince gloomily said, I really can't see. Father has the intentions you speak of. If he didn't have those intentions, wouldn't he have destroyed you a long time ago? The Empress had a tone of exasperation. The crown prince forced a smile and said, Perhaps father is just looking for an opportunity. The Empress shook her head and calmly said, You're wrong. Compared to the other brothers, you have one great advantage, but you yourself still can't see it. The crown prince asked in surprise, What advantage? There was a chill in the Empress's calm expression. She slowly said, The great prince has Dongyi background. The second prince's birth mother, Lady Shu, also has some power in the capital. The third prince's birth mother, Yi Guipin, comes from the Liu family, which is a large family in the capital. She also has Fan Xian to rely on. Of all the princes, only we, mother and son, are alone without any family power to use. After all, the emperor and I have lived together for so many years. The empress smiled disdainfully. The empress smiled disdainfully and said, Everything about your father is good, but he is too suspicious. If the throne of the Qin kingdom is to be passed down, of course, he is afraid that the Li family's royal power will fall to an outsider. Thus, when choosing a successor, he cannot accept the successor standing behind an overly large family power. Thus, the second prince can't, and the third prince even more so. The empress's cold gaze was like two knives digging into the crown prince's heart. Only you, the emperor, had that old cripple kill your mother's family. One, it was for that evil demoness. Another, wasn't it to clear away obstacles for you in the future? Don't be afraid, my child. She gently stroked the crown prince's cold cheek and sighed. If there are no major problems, no matter how many tricks the emperor uses, it is all to urge you to grow and become strong. Many years ago, he had already chosen you, and he has never doubted his own choice. The empress smiled nervously and said, Even if his choice was wrong to begin with. Her expression suddenly became severe. She gritted her teeth and said, So, do you understand? The reason you can have the position of crown prince and be able to ensure your future position is all because your mother's family paid with 3,000 lives. Those are your elders, your family. They're all dead. Their blood and corpses were used to pave this path to the imperial chariot for you. So, you must endure it until the day you succeed. A spring breeze floated through the royal palace, but this spring breeze was very cold and made one shiver in fear. The crown prince couldn't help but shiver because the Empress Dowager's great-grandmother was strict in managing the back palace. In reality, he had only recently learned the truth of the night Jingdo bled with blood from his mother's mouth. He knew that his grandfather and uncle had all died in that political turmoil. So, his father wanted to get rid of the relatives by his side. His heart began to tighten, and he didn't know how to react. If his mother's analysis was correct, then as long as he behaved calmly enough, and as long as there were no major problems in the world in the future, that dragon throne would ultimately be his. The crown prince's gaze gradually hardened. He looked at his mother and nodded his head heavily. Mother and son seemed to have forgotten what they had once said in their conversation. The prerequisite for the crown prince to succeed to the throne was that no major problems occurred. Everyone in the world knew, regardless of whether it was Chun Pingping or Sir Fan Jr., they were both sinister and ruthless people who were best at finding major problems from no problems. The palace and the court were actually two existences of one. Through the emperor, who could not be ignored, the two fields of power were perfectly and harmoniously united together. If the officials wanted to curry favor with the emperor, they had to curry favor with the nobles in the palace. If the nobles in the palace wanted to extend their hands outside the palace, they had to borrow the officials outside to do things for them. The so-called interest groups all came about this way. Thus, when the matter of the emperor losing his temper in the royal study regarding the Ministry of Revenue's deficit spread outside the palace through countless channels, the entire officialdom began to stir. The highest principle of being an official was that if the emperor did not like something, the officials had to quickly follow. Even if the person standing opposite the emperor was a legendary figure like the Grand Preceptor, the officials still had to bravely take the lead and not be willing to fall behind. With the emperor's mood as an indicator, this kind of thing would never go wrong. However, there was a clear time difference between the news from the palace and the reaction from the court conference. The officials were more steady and cautious than usual. One reason was because investigating the deficit of the Ministry of Revenue would inevitably involve the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. Everyone knew that not only was Fan Jian extremely shrewd and ruthless, but he also had a close relationship with Imperial Prince Jing and a brotherly relationship with the Emperor. The officials didn't know what kind of affection the Emperor still had for Fan Jian. The second reason the officials were careful was very simple. It was because Fan Jian's son was named Fan Xian, and his courtesy name was Enji. He was a commissioner of the Overwatch Council and the imperial envoy with full power in Jiangnan Road. Although everyone knew that Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child, everyone also knew that Fan Xian's loyalty and filial piety were famous throughout the Qin kingdom. There were countless stories circulating among the people, such as refusing to recognize his father even when he died in the palace, and risking his life to enter the Fan Ancestral Hall at the annual meeting. If the investigation reached Minister Fan, no one knew what kind of reaction Fan Xian would have. The officials only knew that the second prince had once wanted to use the second young master of the Fan Manor. In the end, he had angered Fan Xian. Fan Xian had used countless vicious and sinister moves to arrogantly beat the second prince, who had already become a powerful force, into two ends. He had been utterly defeated and cut a sorry figure. In the end, Fan Xian had successfully beaten the second prince in a house arrest. This glorious battle result was enough to intimidate most of the officials who wanted to take advantage of politics. Sir Fan Jr. didn't even care about the second prince, much less these officials. However, the pressure from the palace was growing stronger and stronger. Furthermore, news from various sources had confirmed that the emperor indeed had the intention of taking action against the Ministry of Revenue. The true source of the emperor's unhappiness these days was the Ministry of Revenue. Thus, the restless officials finally suppressed their impulses and began to go home to write memorials. Among these officials, there were upright officials who sincerely served the country and hoped the court would stop investigating the Ministry of Revenue's deficit. There were also officials who had received the orders of nobles in the palace and wanted to use this matter to bring down the Fan family. They wanted to play a game of hitting a bull across the mountain and make Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan, lose his reputation. Most of them were political opportunists who spent many years in the court trying to figure out the emperor's will in order to climb up. In short, for many different reasons, the Jingdo court officials had a rare unified opinion. They asked the court to thoroughly investigate the rumored deficit of the Ministry of Revenue. They had to give the people of the world and the emperor an explanation. It is difficult to guarantee that it will be within an hour, such as 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. I hope everyone can understand. Thank you. Chapter 384. In my free time, I suddenly wanted to reread the earlier parts of the Qinyu year and start from the 5th volume. I didn't think I would be so engrossed in it. Some of the chapters were really written with talent, I thought narcissistically. The Qin court conference began as scheduled. The sky was still brightening, and the royal palace was still cold. The emperor still sat high on the throne, and the officials still humbly and straightforwardly discussed the government affairs of each province. After all the urgent matters had ended, the emperor, with a faint tiredness on his face, opened his mouth and said, "Is there anything else?" An official from the Supreme Court stepped out and carefully reported, "Your Majesty, about the matter of Sir Fan Jr. of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. How should we deal with it?" What many officials in Jingdo did not expect was that the investigation into the Ministry of Revenue's deficit, which had been accumulating power for many days, had not yet begun. The criticism of Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan, had already arrived fiercely. Within 3 days, Memorials from the Jiangnan imperial censors and other officials flew into the royal palace in Jingdo like snowflakes. Each word and sentence pointed directly at the head of the palace treasury transport company, Fan Xian, for being arrogant and overbearing. Using his identity as an imperial envoy, he suppressed his colleagues, disregarded the laws of the country and court, and recklessly killed 4 palace treasury treasurers. He aroused the anger of the people and caused the workers of the 3 workshops to go on strike. The 3 workshops of the palace treasury were important pillars of the Qing kingdom's finances. It had been many years since something as major as a strike had happened, so when the news reached Jingdo, it shocked many people. Jingdo and Jiangnan were very far apart, so people did not know the true situation at the Northmin Transport Company Yamen. They also did not know that it was Imperial Censor Guizheng and the officials of the eldest princess faction who were inverting black and white. It was clear that the strike had started and Fan Xian had suppressed and killed people. However, with these officials' impassioned criticism, it became that Fan Xian had killed people without reason first and aroused the anger of the people. In the hearts of the officials, Sir Fan Jr. was indeed someone who could do such an outrageous thing. Thus, before Lao Fan was investigated, the officials began to have deep opinions about Fan Jr. They discussed this matter in court for a few days in a row. However, they never came up with a plan. The emperor also did not relent. Among the civil officials, there were always a few who were not scum. They were not wary of the fact that Fan Xian was the emperor's illegitimate child. On the contrary, because of this matter, they cast even more distrustful gazes toward Fan Xian. They were worried that such a powerful official would harm the foundations of the Qing court and the interests of the people. For example, the scholar, who had already entered the Hall of Governmental Affairs and was beginning to move about in the cabinet, had no contact with Fan Xian. His understanding of Fan Xian was limited to rumors in officialdom and among the people. Although he greatly admired Fan Xian's talent and knowledge through Shu the scholar's introduction, he still somewhat believed what was written in the memorials. The scholar had been a local official for many years and knew how difficult it was to deal with the officials in the capital. He was afraid that Fan Xian would use his family power and background to run amok in the Jiangnan area once he left the capital without anyone to keep him in check. He decided to speak up for the Jiangnan officials. For one, it was to prevent them from being harmed too deeply locally. For another, he was afraid that Sir Fan Jr., whom he somewhat admired, would slip down the wrong path. Grand Secretary who stepped forward and said calmly, "Your Majesty, this matter should be thoroughly investigated." The emperor rubbed his temples and asked, "Thoroughly investigated? I know that Fan Xian has long written a detailed report on this matter. The Overwatch Council also has a council report. The Hall of Governmental Affairs should have a copy on file. Grand Secretary, you should know that the palace treasury trouble this time was caused by Fan Xian investigating old abuses and seeking justice for the workers." Grand Secretary who said in a clear voice, "Your Majesty, this is only Sir Fan Jr.'s one-sided statement. Since there are so many officials who have sent memorials against him, we have to send someone to Jiangnan to ask. If what the memorials say is true, then we have to strictly investigate and properly make up for it. Only then can we not hurt the hearts of the tens of thousands of workers in the palace treasury. If what the memorials say is not true, then we should severely reprimand the Jiangnan road officials and properly comfort Sir Fan Jr. and give him justice." The emperor glanced at him with a not-quite-there smile. He thought that after all this Grand Secretary insisted on sending someone to Jiangnan. However, Jingdo and Jiangnan were so far apart. Even if he sent someone from the capital, would Fan Xian be afraid of him? However, the Qing emperor wanted to use the long-exiled the scholar to return to the capital because he wanted the scholar's stubbornness and uprightness. Just like how he had used Lin Ruofu and Chun Pingping to fight in the arena many years ago, the Qing emperor planned to have the scholar and Fan Xian fight in the arena in the future. Since it was so, he would not speak up at this time and reject the Grand Secretary's face. He smiled slightly and said, "The Grand Secretary's words are reasonable. Choose a person to go to Jiangnan to have a look." No matter what happens, you have to see it with your own eyes to know. Who the scholar wanted was this seemingly fair suggestion to handle the matter. Since his goal had been achieved, he retreated. At this time, Shu Wushu the scholar couldn't help but say worriedly, "Who is right and who is wrong will eventually be found out. I am only worried that after the palace treasury has experienced this storm, there will be problems with this year's revenue. After all, this is Sir Fan Jr.'s first year in charge of the palace treasury. Please give him some pointers, Your Majesty." This was a very gentle suggestion, but it also represented the worries of many officials. They were all worried that Fan Xian would be too ruthless and cause a major problem with the production of the entire palace treasury. However, Shu Wushu's gentleness did not mean that others were gentleness. On the contrary, a few officials used Shu the scholar's words as an opening and began to step forward to express their deep worry and loyalty to the court. They said that Sir Fan Jr. was, after all, young and the palace treasury matters were important. If this year the palace treasury declined too much compared to previous years, shouldn't the court consider choosing someone else? This was a brazen lack of trust in Fan Xian. The meaning was also clear. If Fan Xian could not raise the palace treasury's profit level, or even lower than in previous years, then what right did he have to control the palace treasury? It was because they were brazen and each word seemed to be thinking for the court. Although the officials knew that these officials wanted to move that deity out of the palace treasury, it was not convenient for them to refute. The emperor smiled slightly and said, "We won't know what the quality of the palace treasury is like this year until next year. You are all a bit too impatient. Whether or not Fan Xian will disappoint my expectations will have to wait for some time before we know." The emperor seemed to suddenly think of something and said, "However, the palace treasury bidding ended a few days ago. The bidding documents should have already been escorted back to Jingdo. You all want to see Fan Xian's ability. You should be able to know a thing or two by looking at the results of this bidding." The Qing kingdom's borders were wide, and Jiangnan and Jingdo were far apart. The news of the bidding in Suzhou on March 22nd would soon travel back to Jingdo. Originally, if Fan Xian had taken the secret mail route and the council newspaper, it would have been a few days faster. Perhaps Fan Xian had forgotten, or perhaps it was because of the problem of the bidding documents being kept secret. He had not revealed any information to the emperor or the court beforehand. Furthermore, after dealing with the strike in the 3 workshops in North Min, the Overwatch Council had begun to consciously block the information between the 2 places. Although Jingdo vaguely knew of the bidding incident that had caused a ruckus in Suzhou, they did not know the specifics. The news that should have traveled the fastest, under Fan Xian's suppression, traveled even slower than Great Master Sanshur. The emperor gazed calmly at a person in the line below and said, "Has Taichung Temple received the document?" All of the income of the 3 workshops in the palace treasury was examined and managed by Taichung Temple and the internal court, so the person the emperor was asking about was the official of Taichung Temple. "Morning has just arrived." The official of Taichung Temple coughed and said with a frown, "I was in a hurry to enter the palace, so I haven't seen it yet." The emperor huffed coldly. "Then hurry and bring it." The official of Taichung Temple bowed and quickly jogged out of the palace. "Everyone, wait a bit." The emperor announced the postponement of the court conference with a not-quite-there smile. He took a bowl of tea from eunuch Yao's hands beside him and slowly sipped it. Time passed by minute. The officials in the palace waited anxiously, but they didn't show any expression. Furthermore, they were indeed curious. How was Fan Xian's trip to Jiangnan going? Every year, the palace treasury received 40% of the deposit for the spring opening of bids. It was the first large sum of income the Qing court received each year. It was impossible for these officials not to look forward to it with excitement and nervousness as they waited. The emperor looked at these officials with cold eyes and felt slightly unhappy in his heart. He understood why all of the civil officials had to stand out and express their opinions toward Fan Xian. Even Xu Wu, who had a good relationship with Fan Xian, could not stand out. It was because Fan Xian was his illegitimate son. The officials had long had a stomach full of complaints about the court placing Fan Xian in such an important position. They always felt that this matter was not proper. It was all because the emperor cared for his own flesh and blood, so he used public tools and official positions to comfort him. But this palace treasury is mine. This world is mine. This son is also mine. The emperor thought coldly. When was it your turn to talk so much? However, the emperor also knew that if Fan Xian truly failed to live up to expectations and turned Jiangnan into a mess, the palace treasury would also become decadent and harm an important part of the country, answering the worries of the officials. No matter how protective he was, he would have no choice but to move him back. However, the emperor had confidence in Fan Xian. This confidence had been gradually cultivated. Ever since Fan Xian had entered the capital from Danzhou, this emperor had carefully and meticulously watched Fan Xian's every move. He wanted to see just what kind of ability the child he had with her would display. In all of these things, Fan Xian's performance had not disappointed him. His literary ability was 300 poems in front of the palace hall. His martial ability was a 9th-level martial artist, and his fame was a gift from Zhuang Mohan. His ability to seize money was extraordinary, but he was not greedy or despicable. Even his romantic spirit was not something a normal young talent could achieve. As for his grasp of the state of the court, it was not like that of an 18-year-old young man. His loyalty to his ruler and filial piety to his father were truly something to brag about. When all was said and done, the emperor was still a normal middle-aged man. He couldn't help but feel a bit of pride toward Fan Xian's illegitimate child. After all, this was his seed. Thus, when the officials began to express doubt toward Fan Xian, he had Taichung Temple immediately report the details of the palace treasury bidding. Although he didn't know the exact number, the emperor had never doubted Fan Xian's ability to scrape the land. Scrape the land was the simplest skill for an official. A wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the hall. The official of Taichung Temple ran in with a red face and incessantly wiping the sweat from his forehead. Following behind him was the vice official of Taichung Temple, Ren Xiao, who was panting tiredly. Running all the way from Taichung Temple to Taiji Palace had indeed used up a lot of energy. After a simple bow, the emperor had the two of them rise. His body leaned forward, and with a glimmer of interest on his face, he asked, "How is it?" The various elders of the court in the hall also looked nervously at the two officials of Taichung Temple. The official of Taichung Temple gulped and didn't have time to say anything. With a happy expression, he reported in a loud voice, "Congratulations, Your Majesty." With these words, everyone knew that the palace treasury bidding in the 6th year of the Qin calendar was looking good. Furthermore, it was good, not just good. The officials who had the faint intention of protecting Fan Xian all let out a breath and revealed smiles on their faces. Shu the scholar also nodded his head in relief. Most of the other officials were slightly startled. It seemed that no one had thought that after the eldest princess's power had secretly hindered them in the palace treasury strike, Fan Xian, who had just taken control of the palace treasury, would be able to obtain such a good result. Only Hu the scholar's expression was calm, and there was nothing strange. After the Qing emperor heard these words, his heart also relaxed. Although his expression remained calm, he sat his entire butt back into the chair. Although he had confidence in Fan Xian, before he received a definite return, he was still a bit nervous. The emperor smiled slightly and said, "What is the exact number?" Everyone needed money, and the emperor was no exception. He had all the money in the world and hoped that the total amount of money in the world was as large as possible. He was the biggest landowner in the world. At this time, like all landowners, a faint joy flashed through his eyes. Official Ren Xiao coughed and took out a file. In a clear voice, he read, "On the 22nd of March in the 6th year of the Qin calendar, the Palace Treasury Transport Company has opened the bidding. North, South, and East roads have the right to purchase 16 lots. The total is..." At this point, he seemed to be shocked by the huge number again. He calmed himself down a little and said, "Yes." He calmed his mind and said, 24,220,000. Exactly. Once these swaying words left his mouth, the entire Taiji palace became absolutely silent. For a long time, no one was able to speak. 24,220,000 taels? So much? This was a full 80% more than last year. Fan Xian, how'd he do it? Did he know a sorcery that bewitched people's hearts and turned the Jiangnan royal merchants into fools? The officials were all dumbfounded and looked at each other. They were pressed down by this enormous number until they could not breathe. Everyone's spirits sank into a kind of confusion. There was a crash. Shu the scholar's face was bright red as he fell to the ground, causing a commotion among the officials. It took a long time before they managed to help him up. The scholar's expression was incomparably excited as he said to the emperor on the dragon chair, "Congratulations, Your Majesty. Congratulations, Your Majesty." Only now did the officials react. After a roar of surprise, they turned and bowed to the emperor and sang praises. The flattery was like a tide. The flattery was like the sea. The emperor's grace was like a mountain. The heavens blessed the Qin kingdom. The emperor was wise, and so on and so forth. 24 million liang of silver. Even if only 40% of it could be earned, it was still nearly 10 million liang of silver. Such a large sum of money could be used to do many things, such as repairing the river, strengthening the military, helping the people, or increasing salaries. Regardless of what faction these officials belonged to, they were, after all, the officials of the most powerful Qin kingdom in the world. Thinking of the fact that the court had such a large sum of silver and could solve the urgent problem of the empty national treasury, they all began to cheer. This kind of cheer was not fake. It was true happiness. The officials, regardless of whether they were greedy or not, virtuous or foolish, always hoped for the court to be better. While these people were furiously flattering the emperor, they couldn't help but think of the person they had suspected and opposed earlier. Sir Fan Jr. The palace treasury bidding had gone so smoothly and brought such great benefits to the court. Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan, had to take the most credit. However, how were they going to turn this corner? Thus, some of the officials rolled their eyes and refused to mention the Jiangnan matter no matter what. At this time, it was Hu the scholar who was the first to stand out. Once he stood out, the lively and happy court immediately quieted down. Everyone wanted to know what Hu the scholar wanted to say. Hu the scholar calmly reported, "This amount is truly hard to believe. I don't hope that Sir Fan has used some other method, like draining the pond to catch the fish. This year, the Jiangnan royal merchants have been squeezed dry. If the palace treasury's production can't keep up, what will happen next year?" In the midst of the peace, there was suddenly an additional discordant note. It truly made people uncomfortable. The crowd of officials clamored. Even those who didn't like Fan Xian couldn't stand it any longer. They all spoke up for the Palace Treasury Transport Company, thinking that Hu the scholar's words were inappropriate. The emperor also broke away from his earlier excitement. He gazed coldly at Hu the scholar and said, "In your opinion, Fan Xian has obtained so much silver for the court. Instead of being rewarded, he should be punished?" Hu the scholar shook his head and said resolutely and decisively, "My words are only a glimmer of misgivings. After all, I'm not in Jiangnan and do not know the specifics. I'm only doing my duty to remind the emperor. As for Sir Fan Jr., as long as there are no problems with the bidding this time, he should not be punished at all. Instead, he should be greatly rewarded." The emperor calmed his state of mind and quietly asked, "In whose opinion, how should he be rewarded? Although it is a matter of silver, it is the foundation of the country," Hu the scholar calmly said. "Sir Fan Jr. has performed such a great service, so he should receive an extraordinary reward." The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "What is an extraordinary reward?" After completely investigating the matter of the bids in North Min and Suzhou, Hu the scholar raised his head and warmly said, "I am willing to recommend Sir Fan Jr. to join the Hall of Governmental Affairs and discuss matters in the cabinet." After these words were said, the court was shaken. The officials were shocked. What kind of role was the Hall of Governmental Affairs? It was the center of the court. After Prime Minister Lin left, the Qing kingdom no longer had the position of prime minister. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were responsible for the functions of the prime minister, particularly after Qin Hung took the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison. After the Minister of Justice, Yin Hangshu, left, and who the scholar returned to the capital, the position of the Hall of Governmental Affairs in the cabinet was already set. If one could enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs, it was equivalent to entering the highest decision-making authority of the court. Did who the scholar want to recommend Fan Xian into the cabinet? The officials wondered which side who the scholar was on. Why did he say such bad things one moment and then give Fan Xian such power and such a high position the next? The Minister of Justice, Yin Hangshu, stared at who the scholar with a glimmer of jealousy and confusion. Unexpectedly, the emperor heard this suggestion and didn't even think. He straightforwardly said, "No, Fan Xian is too young." The officials were slightly at ease. They thought that the emperor's suggestion was acceptable. Otherwise, it would be too absurd to have a young man, not yet 20, enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters. Who the scholar calmly said, "In ancient times, there were 16 sages who were prime ministers. Furthermore, the Hall of Governmental Affairs is the emperor's writing organization. It is not a true prime minister. Furthermore, Sir Fan Jr. is talented and brimming with talent. He holds many positions and has many abilities. Such a talent should help the emperor share his worries and solve his difficulties in court." The emperor glanced at him with a not-quite-there smile and still simply shook his head. He is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. According to the Qing law, Overwatch Council officials cannot be a court official. Even after he retires, he can only take up a position in the Three Temples. But the scholar followed up quickly. In the end, the Qing law is not as good as the emperor's edict. His youth is not a problem, and his position in the Overwatch Council is not a problem. If it were not so, how could I say is an exceptional reward? The emperor smiled and waved his hand. There is no need to discuss this matter further. I will not allow it. The emperor's words could not be taken back. Who the scholar could only retreat. However, there was no other expression on his face. The emperor narrowed his eyes and looked down. He saw the scholar and Shu Wu exchange glances. He knew that Shu Wu, this old man, had received the news beforehand and immediately guessed why who the scholar would take the opportunity to make such an absurd suggestion. A talent, and Ji is indeed a talent. It was precisely because the abilities Fan Xian had displayed were too shocking that the civil official system would always be wary of Fan Xian in the Overwatch Council. They were more than willing to let Fan Xian leave the Overwatch Council and throw him back into the warm embrace of the civil officials. After all, Fan Xian wore the hat of an immortal poet and was faintly the leader in the hearts of the young scholars. For Hu and Shu the scholar, the two heads of the civil officials, accepting Fan Xian was not a difficult matter. Hu the scholar and Shu the scholar were people who cherished talent and understood the situation. They could see the emperor's plans for the future, but they were not willing to let Fan Xian, a bright pearl, be thrown into the darkness of the Overwatch Council. Regardless of whether it was for the safety of the civil official system or for Fan Xian, they both wanted to poach Fan Xian over. Although it was a bit early to bring this up, Hu the scholar had already seized this rare opportunity to demonstrate the sincerity of the civil official system. Many years in advance, he had begun to lay the groundwork for his speech. The Qing emperor had always been tolerant of the officials' little thoughts and didn't care much about them. On the contrary, from this matter, he felt more and more how much glory his illegitimate child had brought to the royal family. The emperor's heart was proud. His expression was calm, but his gaze was complicated. He glanced at the Minister of Revenue, who had been silent in the line the entire time, his son's father in name, Fan Jian. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 385. Although the emperor's gaze only lightly brushed past it landed in the eyes of many observant people in the court. However, at this time, the palace treasury bidding documents had arrived. Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan, had raised his official reputation to a terrifying level because of the 20 million liang of silver. Presumably, the emperor would be happy. Were they going to investigate the Ministry of Revenue's debts at this time? The silver that the Jiangnan Palace Treasury had sent was enough to smooth everything out. Furthermore, if they investigated the Ministry of Revenue at this time, would it appear that they were not giving Fan Xian face? In reality, the officials all knew that the Ministry of Revenue had to be investigated in the end because rumors of the Ministry of Revenue's deficit had spread for a long time. The so-called wind from an empty cave might not be without reason. Furthermore, the emptiness of the national treasury before and after the year seemed to faintly confirm this point. If this matter was not cleared up, the Qin Kingdom's court would not have a stable footing. However, investigating was investigating. As for when to investigate, that would require great wisdom to decide. Fan Xian had just performed a great service. Immediately, these officials jumped out to accuse Fan Xian. It seemed a bit unreasonable. They didn't know what the emperor meant. No matter what, there needed to be someone taking the lead. Thus, after the court had calmed down slightly, an official rose and knelt on the ground to report to the emperor about the Ministry of Revenue's deficit. He spoke with certainty as if how much money was missing from the national treasury had all fallen into his eyes. No one knew where this official got his confidence from. The emperor's meaning was very unclear. Listening to the official's words, he furrowed his brows and nodded. For a moment, the officials didn't know whether the emperor wanted to investigate or not. The officials didn't dare stare at the emperor's expression, so they all secretly glanced at the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, in the ranks. They saw that Fan Jian still had a serious expression. Amidst the solemnity, there was a hint of contentment. They couldn't help but cooperate with this official's composure. The matter of the Ministry of Revenue. After the discussion in the royal study, an edict will come down. The emperor coldly finished these words and announced the end of the court meeting. With a wave of his dragon robe, he moved behind the screen. The officials walked out of the palace. Along the way, they couldn't resist whispering and guessing what the emperor was thinking. That afternoon, in the not very spacious royal study, under the dragon couch, there were a few embroidered stools. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the Minister of Appointments Yan Hangshu, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Works were all seated. Next to the dragon couch, the Crown Prince, the First Prince, and the Second Prince stood respectfully on the ground with their hands hanging by their sides. The Emperor sat on the flat couch. With a calm expression, he flipped through the memorials the court officials had presented. Actually, since last night, there had been an endless stream of officials who had begun to send in memorials to accuse the Ministry of Revenue of running a deficit and officials misappropriating national funds. However, after the banknotes Fan Xian had sent, this powerful wave of attention was immediately stopped. The emperor also did not allow the officials to debate this matter in the court conference. Sitting on the embroidered stools, Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar quietly met each other's eyes. They knew that the emperor had placed the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue in the royal study to discuss because he wanted to give Minister of Revenue Fan Jian some face. However, why was Minister Fan not in the royal study today? If the emperor truly had the intention of returning to the Fan Manor, he should have allowed him to defend himself here. The two scholars' hearts were slightly nervous. Looking at the emperor's arrangements, it seemed to be different from what they had guessed. The deficit of the Ministry of Revenue looked like it was real and not another of the emperor's little tricks. It looked like Minister Fan was truly going to be pushed to the heart of the struggle. Fan Jian is sick. Seeming to guess what the officials were guessing, the emperor didn't even raise his head as he spoke in a quiet voice. However, it was difficult to suppress a faint anger in his lightly raised voice. The officials smiled bitterly and thought to themselves that this chief steward of the Qin court was truly a wonderful person. Every time someone in court accused him, he never did anything. He was too lazy to care about any alliances. He even seemed disdainful of entering the palace to defend himself. It was just such a simple move to escape from illness. Minister Fan's courage. It looked like it was not as small as people had previously thought. Everyone speak. The emperor threw the memorial in his hand to one side and said, "Regarding the matter of the Ministry of Revenue, what do you all think?" The faces of these elders in the center of the Qin court were calm. Their eyes were on their noses, and their noses were on their hearts. Even if they were beaten to death, they would not be the first to jump out and offend the Fan family. Although they all thought that the Ministry of Revenue needed to be investigated for the sake of the court, these people all had good relationships with Fan Jian. In addition, since the entire court suspected the Ministry of Revenue, there would always be someone who couldn't hold back their anger before them. Unexpectedly, the elders all had good self-control skills. After a moment, no one spoke. The royal study sank into an incomparably awkward silence. The crown prince looked at this strange scene and couldn't help but laugh in his heart. He thought to himself that the officials only wanted stability, but they had not expected that this kind of behavior would probably make his father more and more unhappy in his heart. At this moment, it was time for him to show off. He quickly coughed and glanced at Shu the scholar. Shu the scholar paused and also felt that the situation was a bit delicate. The emperor had asked a question, yet none of the officials dared to reply. Where the emperor put his face. He quickly opened his mouth and said, "Your Majesty." He only had time to say 2 words before the emperor's suppressed anger exploded out. He scolded, "The memorials to investigate the Ministry of Revenue were submitted by you." He picked up the memorials beside him and waved them around, angrily scolding. "At this time, the ones who are acting like dead birds in front of me are also you. What use does the court have for you, silent gourds?" The officials in the royal study were afraid. They quickly left their seats and bowed to admit their guilt with bitter smiles. The emperor drank a bowl of white fungus soup and slightly calmed the anger in his stomach. He huffed coldly and waved his hand to indicate for them to sit. Since the emperor had become angry, the limelight was clear. Shu the scholar had a good relationship with the Fan Manor. He felt that he was wholeheartedly working for the public and did not have a personal grudge against Minister Fan. Additionally, he did not want anyone to use the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue to attack the Fan Manor. He took the lead and said, "The matter of the Ministry of Revenue is very important. This is where the court's finances are located. Although I don't know where the recent rumors came from or where the Imperial Censorate learned that the Ministry of Revenue owed so much, since there is such a reason, it must be investigated. Let's see how your Majesty intends to investigate." Shu the scholar considered his words and smiled slightly. These years, Minister Fan has always been in charge of the Ministry of Revenue. Although he was an assistant minister a few years ago, because the old minister was always sick in bed, the affairs of the Ministry of Revenue were all handled by him. You must know that the matter of the Ministry of Revenue is the most trivial, so the court officials often overlook its importance. Managing the Ministry of Revenue is difficult to achieve merit, but if something happens, it is too easy. In the end, it is nothing more than a hard job. Sir Fan has managed the Ministry of Revenue for many years. Although he has not achieved merit, he has never made a mistake. This is actually a great merit for the court. I hope your Majesty can understand Sir Fan's hard work and show me more leniency. Even if you want to investigate, you cannot be too negligent. With these words, everyone knew Shu Wu's position. The Ministry of Revenue had to be investigated, but it could not become a mess. The Crown Prince laughed coldly in his heart, thinking that Shu the scholar's 2 paragraphs were beautiful. Since he didn't know where the rumors came from, it was hinting that even if the Ministry of Revenue owed something, perhaps it was someone in court who wanted to use the opportunity to do so. Shu the scholar also nodded in agreement. The investigation must be investigated. The emperor's face was calm. He asked the Minister of Works, "What do you mean?" A cold sweat trickled down the Minister of Works' back. He smiled bitterly and said, "These 2 years, the Ministry of Works has acted according to your Majesty's edict and the procedures of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. When moving money to the Ministry of Revenue, it has often not gone smoothly. However, official business does not interfere with private matters. I do not think that the Ministry of Revenue is purposely making things difficult for me. Perhaps the Ministry of Revenue really does sometimes find it inconvenient to move. This was a critical argument. If the Ministry of Revenue did not have a deficit, how could it be inconvenient to move? Immediately after, the Minister of Appointments, Yin Hangshu, also clearly expressed his attitude. He was in charge of the examination of officials and the appointment and removal of personnel. Of course, he suggested that the emperor should thoroughly investigate the Ministry of Revenue. If there were problems, he should punish them. If there were no problems, it would reduce the pressure on the Ministry of Revenue. The emperor listened to these officials' secretive words and felt slightly annoyed. He furrowed his brows and used his finger to gently knock on the low table on the couch. Pointing at the thin memorials on the table, he said, "Memorials from Jiangnan. You all take a look." Eunuch Yao calmly stepped forward and accepted the memorials, handing them out to the officials' hands. For a moment, in the royal study, only the sound of the officials flipping through the memorials and the gradually heavy breathing could be heard. After a long time, the officials finally finished exchanging and reading. They raised their heads with shock on their faces. Xu Wu and Hu the scholar met each other's eyes and quickly turned their heads away. Neither of them could hide the deep worry in their hearts. If what the memorial said was true, then Minister Fan's daring was truly too big. Jiangnan Road Imperial Censor Guizheng has written that Fan Xian chose a puppet surnamed Xia to control during the palace treasury bidding. At the same time, he provided a large sum of silver for the Xia person to enter the palace treasury door. On one hand, he allowed the Xia person to snatch 6 of the treacherous paths bids. On the other hand, he allowed him a clash with the royal merchants and forcefully raised this year's bidding silver. The emperor's calm voice rang out again. It was so calm that it was as if he was talking about a topic that had nothing to do with him. Guizheng's suspects were the large amount of silver in Fan Xian's hands came from. The emperor looked at the officials and smiled coldly. "I'm also suspicious." Putting aside the matter of Fan Xian allowing his subordinates to compete with the royal merchants for profit, which official can tell me? Where did he get so much silver? Xu Wu's throat was dry. He couldn't speak. Only now did he know why so many court officials were certain that the Ministry of Revenue's deficit was enormous. It was because of the Jiangnan problem. The emperor's meaning was also very clear. Fan Xian was able to completely control the situation of the palace treasury bidding and use his subordinates to secretly control the 6 treacherous paths bids. The enormous amount of silver involved in this matter probably came from the Ministry of Revenue, from his father's hands. The officials were silent. At this moment, they were not afraid of offending Minister Fan. They were still immersed in this kind of shock. Looking at the inscription on the memorial, it should have arrived in the royal palace last night. The emperor should have long known that Fan Xian had used some dishonorable methods in the palace treasury bidding. However, the emperor's joyous expression in the court earlier was not fake. The emperor's silent endurance and deep foresight were indeed not something an official could guess. Perhaps the emperor liked Fan Xian earning silver for him, but did not like Fan Xian using the court's silver to earn silver for him. Only the emperor could move the court's silver. No one could move it on their own. It looked like the Fan family had truly touched the emperor's reverse scale this time. Amidst the silence, the second prince, who had only been allowed into the royal study again in February, smiled slightly and said, "Father, I have something to say." "Speak," the emperor said coldly. A calm smile rose to the second prince's gentle and beautiful face. He bowed to the officials and quietly said, "I have some grievances with Commissioner Fan, but I do not dare to not express my opinion because of this matter. I believe that since Fan Xian is far away in Jiangnan and has the identity of an imperial envoy, there is naturally no one holding him back. However, he allowed his subordinates to steal the court's silver for his own use, which is a great crime. The Ministry of Revenue's private transfer of national funds to Jiangnan is even closer to rebellion." This was setting the tone. Everyone knew he was targeting the Fan family, but no one could refute anything. The great prince, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly opened his mouth and said, Jiangnan Imperial Censor Guizheng has an old grievance with Fan Xian. Back then, in the Great Hall of the Ministry of Justice, he was almost punched in the back by Fan Xian. After saying this, he didn't continue to speak. Shu the scholar sat on the bench and listened. He thought to himself that this was an opportunity that had to be seized. Otherwise, if it really was as Guizheng said in his memorial, not only would the Ministry of Revenue be in chaos, Fan Xian and Jiangnan would also not have a good ending. With both sides in chaos, who knew how many heads would fall to the ground? The Qing court could not endure such a large disturbance. He quickly followed the great prince's words and said with a smile, "Your Majesty, I am not afraid to speak rudely about Guizheng, but I will say one more thing. This person rejoices in grandiose achievements and has done many rash actions. Last year, he was demoted to Jiangnan by the emperor. It is difficult to guarantee that he will not purposely exaggerate the matter and frame people because of his old grievance with Sir Fan Jr." Once the words "old grievance" came out, everyone couldn't help but glance at the second prince who had the deepest grievance with Fan Xian. Although the second prince still maintained a beautiful smile on his face, in reality, his face was beginning to heat up. He glanced at the great prince with hidden bitterness. Since his youth, he and the great prince had a deep brotherly relationship. He completely didn't understand why his big brother had to stand on that bastard side. There were some things to do today and in the next few days. Chapter 386. After Shu the scholar finished speaking, the emperor nodded his head. Even if he had other thoughts in his heart, he could not say anything at this time. Because of Fan Xian's ruckus at the Ministry of Justice last year, the court had sent the imperial censor of the left far away to Jiangnan Road. The excuse they used was that he was overzealous and had bad morals. Naturally, the words that the emperor had said could not be taken back. However, at that time, the emperor wanted to appease Fan Xian. Now, the emperor wanted to use Guo Zheng's memorial to do something. Being blocked by Shu the scholar, he couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly in his heart. He wondered if this was a pit he had dug and jumped into. Isn't there another eunuch who went to Jiangnan? At this time, the crown prince jumped out to show his stupidity and chuckled. "Father, although we can't believe Imperial Censor Guizheng's one-sided words, once that eunuch comes back and says it, we'll know exactly what happened in Jiangnan." These words appeared to be steady, but in reality, they were sinister. How could eunuch ruin Fan Xian? It was all because of a word from the Empress Dowager in the royal palace. The crown prince had confidence in this matter. The emperor glared at him and said in a cold voice, "How can the words of a eunuch be trusted? The ancestral teachings are here, don't forget." The crown prince was timid and didn't say anything more. Serving to the side, eunuch Yao was silent. His expression did not change. Wait for Xue Qing's memorial. The emperor closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Everyone in the royal study nodded their heads, thinking that the words of a proper governor had to be more trustworthy. Hu the scholar, who had not expressed his opinion, finally opened his mouth and said, "Since it is so, then the Jiangnan matter can be put aside for now. If there really is such a thing, I truly cannot believe it. Just as the second prince said earlier, if there really was someone secretly moving national funds to Jiangnan for profit, it would be close to rebellion. I believe that Minister Fan is not such an insane person. However, since the Jiangnan Road Imperial Censor and some local officials have sent memorials, the court cannot ignore it. The investigation of the Ministry of Revenue should indeed begin. First, it has to convince all the civil and military officials of the court. Second, it has to wash away the accusations Minister Fan has received. The Qing emperor still maintained a superficial respect for these scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. After a slight silence, he nodded. Suddenly, he laughed self-mockingly and said, "Even if they did something like this, it can't be considered crazy. However, I am curious. Have the officials thought about how to investigate?" Although a faint self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips, everyone in the royal study felt an involuntary chill in their hearts. They could hear that the emperor indeed had a strong opinion of Minister Fan. However, No one understood. Why had the Fan Manor, which had always been deeply favored by the emperor, suddenly become a place the emperor did not like to see? How had Fan Jian offended his majesty? The emperor's last question made the officials speechless. They didn't know how to respond. There were two systems used by the Qin court to supervise the governance of officials. One was the imperial censorate, which was the imperial censorate who were used to being flogged. The other system was, of course, the Overwatch Council, which held incomparable power. The imperial censorate was an organization to prevent corruption. It had the power to report rumors and memorials. That was why Jiangnan Road Imperial Censor Guizheng dared to report Fan Xian using the national funds without any evidence, allowing it to enter the treasury and competing with merchants for profit. The Overwatch Council was an organization that investigated after the fact. It had great power. After being authorized by the emperor, it could interrogate all the civil and military officials of the court. Under normal circumstances, if there was a problem in one of the 6 ministries, the one to investigate the matter would be the Overwatch Council. They could invite all officials under 3rd level to the square, gray-black building to drink tea. If the matter reached the level of vice minister or minister, they would ask for an edict again to ask for special privileges and investigate one level at a time. The Ministry of Revenue had a deficit. Logically speaking, it should be handled according to this plan. The problem was, presently, the Overwatch Council had the director above and the 8th Bureau below. Director Chun Pingping, who was incompetent and terrified all officials, had not personally handled the case for a number of years. In the past year, he had basically been in the Chun Garden outside the capital and no longer oversaw matters. Presently, there was an additional position between the director and the 8th Bureau. It was a very powerful and special position. The commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. Fan Xian already had the power to mobilize the entire Overwatch Council. Other than the appointment and removal of personnel, his power was not much different from Chun Pingping's. If he had the Overwatch Council investigate the deficit in the Ministry of Revenue, the officials in the royal study all shook their heads, thinking, if you let your son investigate your father, it would be a miracle if he could find a problem. If this matter got out, Northern Qi, Dongyi, and all the people under heaven would probably treat this matter as the biggest joke in Qing officialdom. Shu the scholar smiled bitterly and said, "Looks like we have to have the Overwatch Council avoid suspicion this time. However, at this moment, I don't know how to arrange the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue." The old officials beside him repeatedly nodded their heads. Since they were going to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, they had to investigate it seriously. Regardless of whether they wanted to bring down Fan Jian or wash away the suspicions on Fan Jian's body, they had to be treated with a serious attitude and not turn it into a child's play. At this moment, the emperor laughed coldly and said, "Why not follow the old rules?" This, Shu the scholar repeatedly cried out bitterly. He thought to himself, why must the emperor pretend to be confused about something so clear? After hesitating for a moment, he finally summoned his courage and said, "Your Majesty, Sir Fan Jr. is, after all, the commissioner with full power in the Overwatch Council. If we have the Overwatch Council investigate the Ministry of Revenue, and this matter gets out, I'm afraid the impact will not be good." "Then let the Overwatch Council investigate," the emperor coldly said. At the same time, the Ministry of Appointments, Ministry of Justice, and Supreme Court will send people to assist. You can also choose a leader to take charge of this matter. Since we are investigating the Ministry of Revenue's deficit, how can a few people do it? The officials in the royal study understood. The so-called sending people to assist was actually just to keep an eye on the Overwatch Council. However, no one understood. Since the emperor had already decided that the Ministry of Appointments, Ministry of Justice, and Supreme Court would investigate the Ministry of Revenue, why did he have to drag the Overwatch Council into this mess? As for the choice of the Minister of Revenue to lead the investigation, the officials were also muttering to themselves. They knew that this mission would greatly offend the Fan family and related officials. But they also knew that if they could actually find a problem, it would be a heavy blow to their reputation under heaven. Weighing the two, in the end, no one dared to take the risk and take on this hot potato. Even the Fan family's enemies, the Minister of Appointments and the Second Prince, were silent. It was impossible to see the emperor's mood. He smiled slightly as his gaze slowly swept across the faces of the officials and his son. In the end, it landed on Who the Scholar's face. Who the Scholar sighed quietly. He knew he could not avoid this disaster. He had entered the capital at the beginning of the year and had been promoted by the emperor to be a Grand Scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Although he had the protection of his literary reputation from many years ago and his reputation as an official in various places, he did not have any clear achievements in the central government. The emperor favored him because he had only been in the capital for a short time and had not become entangled with various powers. He also wanted to use the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue to establish his own authority in court. Who the Scholar was grateful for the emperor's trust and importance. He was faintly resentful that the emperor wanted him to offend the Fan family's father and son. The great prince, who had only sent one sentence and then returned to silence, coldly said before Who the Scholar, "Father, I am willing to be the one to offend people." The emperor chuckled and waved his hand. "You cannot." "Why?" The great prince furrowed his brows. "I dare to use my head to guarantee that I will investigate fairly and not be biased. Father, please believe in my loyalty." The smile on the emperor's face gradually faded. "If I say you cannot, then you cannot. You're the commander of the imperial army, yet you're investigating the Ministry of Revenue. Do you want to set an example of the military interfering in politics?" The emperor's last words were said very harshly. The great prince was depressed and could not continue to argue. Although the emperor had always liked his straightforward personality, since he had been given the heavy hat of the military interfering in politics, he could only mumble and retreat. Who the Scholar left his seat and asked, "I am willing to lead the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue matter." The emperor nodded and then turned to look at the crown prince. Coldly, he said, "Crown Prince, also go. Learn from Who the Scholar. Who the Scholar will lead the investigation. You will be a runner." "I will obey." The crown prince's expression was calm, but he couldn't contain his joy. Although he was only a runner in name, once he sat in the Ministry of Revenue Yamen. Who would not fear him? The crown prince of the Eastern Palace? Other than Who the Scholar, he was also a leader. The crown prince was a bit happy. It looked like after the Hanging Temple, his father's indifferent attitude toward him had finally changed. The officials accepted their orders and left. The royal study became quiet again. The emperor took a sip of tea with a grave and stern expression and rose to leave the bed. Eunuch Yao quickly draped a windbreaker over him. Seeing that the emperor was not in a good mood, he carefully asked, "Your Majesty, shall we return to the palace to rest?" "No." The emperor walked out of the royal study and said, "To the little building." Eunuch Yao quickly followed. He didn't say anything, but he felt strange. Recently, the emperor had been going to the little building more and more often. Outside the palace, a few uneasy court officials raised their hands in farewell. Some proudly prepared to go back and announce to their henchmen that the emperor was preparing to take action against the Ministry of Revenue. Some were worried and prepared to return home to think about how to face the future of the court. Some were still confused and wondered how the emperor's mind had changed in one day. "Xiao Hu, come to my manor for a drink or two." Shu was not afraid of anything. He pulled Who the Scholar, who was preparing to leave first, and spoke straightforwardly. Who the Scholar's head was full of complaints. How could he drink? He repeatedly begged for mercy. "Old Shu, can't you see that my luck is pretty good today? I don't have the mood to write poems." These two liked literature and were the leaders of the civil officials. The emperor did not strictly forbid private interactions between officials, so their relationship was very good. Although there was a large difference in age, they often mingled together. Shu the Scholar made a look. Who the Scholar's heart jumped, and he agreed to this suggestion. The emperor's heart is hard to fathom. Shu Wu's manor was also in the south of the city. It was famous for its seclusion and was not very large. However, the two drunk people were talking under the pavilion. They didn't need to worry about the spring wind blowing their taboo topic out of the wall and being heard by others. Shu Wu sighed and said, I'm afraid this task of yours will be difficult. It really is following your brother's wishes and losing your sister-in-law's wishes." These words compared the emperor to a brother and the Fan family to his sister-in-law. Inevitably, it was a bit out of place. The scholar laughed loudly and said, "What nonsense! Your surname is not Hu. Have you drunk too much?" "It's not nonsense." Shu Wu's expression was serious. He lowered his voice and said, "What do you think you can do?" Looking at the emperor's intentions, he must find out that there is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue before he will let it go. If there really is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue, what will happen to Minister Fan? Right now, the key question is whether or not there is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue. The scholar's expression became worried. "You've explained Sir Fan Jr.'s personality in detail to me. Looking at his clear-headedness with some ruthlessness and his cultured and refined manner of doing things, in order to stabilize Jiangnan and increase taxes, he moved money from the Ministry of Revenue down to Jiangnan. Perhaps it is true. Regardless of whether it is true or not, in any case, as long as the Jiangnan governor Xueqing does not express his stance, the court will not know the situation over there. As for the Ministry of Revenue's deficit," Shu Wu smiled coldly and said, "The Ministry of Revenue is the yamen that manages money. Fighting wars requires money. Repairing rivers requires money. Disaster relief requires money. Repairing gardens requires money. And opening the spring examinations requires money. Everyone in the world is stretching out their hands to the Ministry of Revenue to ask for money. Adding on to the fact that the princes and officials occasionally borrow some, it is truly a mess of accounts." Throughout the dynasties, how could there be a Ministry of Revenue whose accounts are completely clear? The Ministry of Revenue is fated to not be clean, he continued in a cold voice. This Minister Fan of the Qing court started as a low-level official in the Ministry of Revenue and has worked in the Ministry of Revenue his entire life. To be fair, the Ministry of Revenue under his rule is already the cleanest and clearest since the founding of our court. Even so, if one truly want to find faults in it, how could not be found? The scholar slowly nodded his head. He was different from the previous Prime Minister Lin Ruofu and the current arrogant Fan Xian in Jiangnan. Although this Minister of Revenue Fan Jian's hands might not be clean, his conduct was unusually low-key and down-to-earth. In terms of ability, there was absolutely nothing to complain about. His good official reputation was also rarely seen in the court. If such a Minister of Revenue fell in this political struggle, these two scholars would feel it was a great pity. However, this time, it was the emperor who had revealed his intention to have Fan Jian become an official. Why was this? Why is this? Shu Wu furrowed his old brows and straightforwardly asked the question that had been on the minds of the officials in the royal study for a long time. The scholar was silent. Raising his wrist, he raised a cup of strong wine produced by the palace treasury and poured it into his mouth. He didn't speak for a long time. Shu Wu stared into his eyes. He knew that this colleague, who was much younger than him, had judgment in certain areas that was worthy of trust. Being stared at by the other party for a long time, the scholar sighed and slowly said, when no one expected it, the emperor had this thought. It is truly. He seemed to be unable to find any adjectives to describe this emperor. He could only force a smile and say, it is truly admirable. The emperor investigating the Ministry of Revenue appears to be because of rumors in officialdom and the doubts in his heart. In reality, this is a good plan to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Which 3 little birds? Shu Wu's beard was covered in wine as he asked with a lisp. The first bird is, of course, the Ministry of Revenue. It is Minister Fan. If the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue is powerful, Minister Fan will have no choice but to resign and return home. The second bird is the official on the eldest princess's side who initiated this matter. The scholar forced a smile and said, the matter of the Ministry of Revenue and Fan Jian's resignation. How could Fan Xian let it go? Don't worry. The emperor will not allow this matter to implicate Fan Xian. After the matter is over, Fan Xian will still be the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Thus, the Overwatch Council will carry out revenge against the officials on the eldest princess's side. At this time, the Emperor will no longer be forced by the palace to be a mediator. Instead, he will watch as all of this happens. He might even act as if he wants to appease Fan Xian and be forced to remove a few officials. Pressure from the palace? Shu Wu sighed. Why is it that the Emperor can ignore the pressure from the palace after the matter? Can he no longer continue to be a mediator? The reason is simple. Minister Fan's departure and Fan Xian's anger can all be pushed onto the eldest princess's side. As an emperor, the most important thing is to maintain the balance between the officials in court. Fan Xian's side first lost the prime minister and then Minister Fan. In order to maintain the balance, the emperor will have to cut off a large chunk of the other side. Who the scholar continued, this excuse, this emperor's heart, is the best method to convince the old man in the palace. Everything is for the Qing kingdom, isn't it? He smiled and laughed at himself. Shu Wu continued to sigh and asked, then what is the third bird? Who the scholar gazed at him with a not-quite-there smile. The third bird is you and me. Shu Wu was shocked and said, what kind of explanation is this? You have accepted this order. Everything you discuss in the royal study is fair. Fan Xian is not a muddle-headed person. How could he have a grudge against us? What you said is exactly what I wanted to say, who the scholar said. Who told us to reveal in court that we wanted to pull Fan Xian into the cabinet? The emperor's established policy has long been set. In the future, you and I are one side, and Fan Xian's Overwatch Council is another. Since we have other thoughts, the emperor will destroy our thoughts. Even if Fan Xian doesn't hold a grudge against us because of this matter, how could he not hold a grudge against the civil officials who have written to impeach Minister Fan? Once this matter comes out, Fan Xian will certainly give up on the idea of a proper official career. And he will no longer have the possibility of sitting together in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. It is just a guess. Shu Wu laughed in spite of himself. Even if the emperor's heart is difficult to predict, there is no need to make it so complicated. Who the scholar sighed helplessly. It is you who want to say it. In the end, it will be you who will laugh. These words are enough for the two of us to have our heads chopped off 10 times. Don't go around saying it after drinking. No matter what, I am a scholar. Shu Wu chuckled. It is just to accompany the wine. Suddenly, his expression froze. He furrowed his brows and asked, no, the first bird you said is wrong. You have to explain clearly to me why the emperor does not want Minister Fan to continue managing the Ministry of Revenue and why he is forcing Minister Fan to resign. Who the scholar faintly sighed. The reason is actually very simple. It is because the emperor does not want to see Minister Fan's face in court every day. The two leaders of the Qing court civil officials fell silent at the same time and sighed in their hearts. They felt unfair for Fan Jian. It looked like it was best not to casually raise a dragon child. Before the two scholars felt wrong for Minister of Revenue Fan Jian, they had also thought about whether or not they should quickly notify the Fan Manor of the matter of the court preparing to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. Later, they thought about it. The Fan Manor had many connections in the palace. How could they not know? So, they gave up on this thought. Indeed, not long after the meeting in the royal study ended, Fan Jian, who had said he was sick and had returned to his manor, had already received the news. He knew that the emperor would officially begin an investigation into the Ministry of Revenue in the court conference the next day. However, he was not very worried. His serious face had long lost the romantic air of the past. It was only calm and composed. It is not a plan to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. It is a plan to kill 4 birds with 1 stone. Fan Jian smiled slightly and said to the other side, as an official who has been loyal to the emperor for nearly 30 years, my admiration for the emperor has never wavered. Today's matter is truly admirable. Regardless of whether it was in front of or behind others, whenever the emperor was mentioned, Fan Jian would always draw back his brows, calm his spirit, and respect him without a doubt. The 2 words of admiration in the study were said very disrespectfully. What is the 4th bird? Fan Jian extended his right palm and opened it in front of him. Curling his thumb, It was as if he had learned a wondrous palm technique from somewhere. His 4 fingers pointed firmly and unyieldingly toward the sky. The 4th bird is the Overwatch Council. The Emperor wants to see if his order can still smoothly command the terrifying Overwatch Council organization like it did in the past years, and not if, as he fears, it is already in Fan Xian's hands. Xian's progress is too fast. Fan Jian thought of his son far away in Jiangnan and sighed. If the Emperor can't even command the Overwatch Council, then the power in the Fan Manor's hands is a bit too great. The corners of his brows suddenly rose frivolously. Smiling merrily, he said, "Furthermore, the Emperor wants to see just what the true relationship between Chun Pingping and me is. All these years, the Emperor has incomparably trusted me and the old cripple. You know why? It is because before Fan Xian entered the capital, the old cripple and I were never on good terms. What he wanted to do, I resolutely did not do. What I wanted to do, he resolutely opposed." Fan Jian's expression darkened. Now that I think about it, it was probably me and Chun Pingping who suspected each other. We suspected that the other had played a dishonorable role in that incident many years ago. But Xian entered the capital. He continued to explain in a quiet voice. The suspicion between Chun Pingping and I lessened greatly. Naturally, the Emperor's suspicion of us increased. Most importantly, Xian is becoming more and more brilliant. Each time Xian becomes more brilliant, the Emperor thinks of what happened in the past and sees me a bit less pleasing to the eye. The Emperor is jealous. That is why I am resigning. The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, finally came to a conclusion. He immediately used a frivolous expression that was rarely seen on his face these days and mockingly said, "However, you know me. I have always been silent and good at acting. But in my bones, I am a very stubborn and ruthless person. He wanted me to follow Lin Ruofu and ask for my resignation so that no one would shed all pretense of cordiality. However, I refused to resign. In any case, the Emperor always cares more about the problem of face than his officials." To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 387. You taught me this. Fan Jian sighed and rubbed his fingers together, feeling the sensation brought by the paper. On the paper was a drawing of a woman's head. Although there were only a few strokes, it vividly outlined the woman's expression and appearance. In particular, the eyes of the woman in the drawing were compassionate, gentle, and mischievous as they gazed at Fan Jian. The Emperor had the master painter secretly draw your portrait in the royal palace. Fan Jian looked at the woman in the drawing and smiled. But for me, your appearance has always been clear in my mind. Every time I want to talk to you, I can't help but draw one. I'll draw the mischievous you, the cold you, the sad you, the happy you. So many of you. Which one is the real you? It's a pity that I can no longer ask you. Fan Jian sighed and passed the paper to the candlestick to burn. He looked at the beautiful face gradually disappearing into the flames and said in a daze, "If the Emperor and I had not returned to our home in Danzhou to spend the summer, we would not have met you, and there would not have been any of the things that happened later. Perhaps I'm still that painter who lingers in the brothel all day." The minister pulled up the corners of his lips, and a self-mocking smile rose to his face. "You said before, this world needs the profession of an artist. Unfortunately, in the end, I became the person with the strongest stench of copper in the entire Qin kingdom." The flames on the paper gradually burned to the center, leaving behind only a few black-colored pieces of paper. "You have always treated me as the most trustworthy brother," Fan Jian said in the end. In the end, Fan Jian said, "I am very grateful for your trust, so don't worry. Even if I don't have the ability to change too much, at the very least, I will persist in standing in the capital and watch Xian gradually grow up." A soft knock came from outside the study. "Come in," Fan Jian said with a smile. Lady Lu walked in with a cup of sour berries and gently placed it on the desk. There was a lingering worry on her face. News of what had happened in the palace had long reached home from Iguapin. As the mistress of the Fan Manor, of course, she knew what kind of predicament her master would face in the court the next day. Fan Jian glanced at her and sighed. "Don't worry, His Majesty will not treat me too harshly." A slight resentment flashed through Lu Shi's eyes. She quietly said, "If His Majesty cherished old friendships, he would not have been incited by those thieves to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. Of the 6 ministries, who is clean from beginning to end?" Fan Jian shook his head and said, "You must believe in His Majesty. This matter involves the affairs of the court. Of course, it cannot be taken lightly." Madame Lu knew that her master didn't want to continue this sorrowful topic, so she nodded helplessly. Fan Jian raised his bowl toward the lingering smell of burning paper on the desk and said, "To each other." Then he drank it all in one gulp. Madame Lu was slightly startled and thought to herself, "Who is the Lord honoring?" The next day, the court conference reconvened. As everyone expected, the emperor harshly criticized the Ministry of Revenue's clumsy performance these 2 years and pushed most of the blame for the empty national treasury onto the Ministry of Revenue. Because the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, still said he was sick and did not appear in court, no one in the Ministry of Revenue could defend themselves. The leaderless Ministry of Revenue officials pitifully endured the attacks of the civil and military officials of the court. The court issued an edict and began to investigate the Ministry of Revenue's deficits these years. The Overwatch Council carried out the specific tasks. The Ministry of Appointments, the Ministry of Justice, and the Supreme Court assisted from the side, and who the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs led the investigation. The Crown Prince stood to the side and filled in the gaps. There were rumors of an investigation of the Ministry of Revenue, so this matter did not surprise anyone. After this array was laid out, the officials still felt a glimmer of shock. With such a large array, it looked like the emperor truly wanted the Ministry of Revenue to suffer. Who knew how Sir Fan Jr. would react when he learned of this matter in Jiangnan? In the afternoon of that day, the officials of the various departments in the joint investigation began to enter the Ministry of Revenue Yamen. There were also the Jingdo garrison responsible for moving troops and watching over the various warehouses. The first target of the officials' investigation was the problem of the accounts of the 7 departments of the Ministry of Revenue. For a moment, the already lively Ministry of Revenue Yamen by the big locust tree became even noisier. There were many fewer officials who had come to collect money, but there were many more officials who had come to investigate. The officials of the Ministry of Revenue nervously welcomed these officials who had come to investigate with an edict into the Yamen. After a long struggle, they finally made enough chairs for the officials to sit. Then, the left and right assistant ministers reported on the Ministry of Revenue's operations for the past 2 years. There were also people who, under the supervision of the Overwatch Council, began to clean up the accounts in preparation for the investigation. Sitting in the middle, who the scholar and the Crown Prince did not make things difficult for these officials of the Ministry of Revenue. With a few warm words of encouragement, they waited for the specific investigation to begin. It was the officials of the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Justice who had found a rare opportunity to make things difficult for the old masters of the Ministry of Revenue. How could they pass it up? Some threatened them with words, and some rebuked them loudly. They made the Ministry of Revenue sound like a place where the world hid filth, and not a place that controlled money and grain for the court. Who the scholar couldn't help but furrow his brows. He knew that the leaders of these 2 departments were not on good terms with the Fan family. If he didn't keep a closer eye on them, the investigation would probably become the other party's method of attacking dissidents. Faced with such a grand display and seeing so many important figures sitting in the hall, including the left and right assistant ministers, all of the officials of the Ministry of Revenue felt a sense of defeat and even despair. Minister Fan was not in the Yamen. These officials of the Ministry of Revenue all felt isolated by the officials of the court. They knew that what they were about to face was the biggest hurdle in their careers and even in their lives. The officials of the Overwatch Council monitored the work of organizing the account books. In a moment, they watched as the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue cleared out as many as 7 large bamboo baskets of account books. With great difficulty, everyone carried them in a hall. The Crown Prince was startled by so many account books and said in shock, "There are so many account books. Matching them one by one, how long will it take?" The left assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue angrily said, "Your Highness, there are 7 departments under the Ministry of Revenue that correspond to the finances of the 7 roads. There are also 4 departments for clearing officials that correspond to river works and other matters. There are 3 large warehouses. Shishan Bookstore and 7 other workshops were transferred from the Palace Treasury Transport Company to the Ministry of Revenue's management last year. There are also 17 warehouses near Jingdo. There's also the Baoquan Bureau and the Qian Law Hall that are responsible for minting money. As for the warehouse Yamen for water affairs, it is far away in Hangzhou," and the assistant minister rattled on and on. He spoke for the time it took to drink a cup of tea without stopping. The Crown Prince's mind was confused and quickly waved his hand to stop him. The various officials who had come to the Ministry of Revenue to investigate were all dumbfounded. They had always known that the Ministry of Revenue was responsible for managing money. Who would have thought that there was such a complicated organizational setup beneath it? It looked like it would not be a matter of a day or 2 to investigate thoroughly. The assistant minister smiled insincerely and said, "Your Highness, the accounts of the ministry are still being sorted out." The 7 large baskets placed here are the accounts of the Shandong Road Money Department. Because a few days ago, the minister ordered me to be in charge of cleaning up the accounts of this road, we were able to move them out quickly. As for the overall accounts, it will take at least a dozen days to clear them out. Rebuked by the assistant minister, the Crown Prince was so angry that he almost choked on his anger. He angrily rebuked, "I don't care how many accounts you have or how many days it will take, but since His Majesty has ordered an investigation, you better move quickly. Otherwise, don't blame me for secretly resisting the order to investigate." Who would have thought that the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue would still carelessly say, "Your Highness the Crown Prince, this lowly official naturally does not have this kind of courage. However, since the officials have come to investigate on the Emperor's orders, we must draw up a plan. Which department should we start investigating? Other than the accounts, when will we start investigating the amount of silver in the treasury? A few million liang of silver. Even if we want to count it, it will probably take a few days." The Crown Prince angrily waved his sleeve. He couldn't be bothered to argue with this picky official. In any case, when the problem was found, there would be consequences for them. Who the scholar watched coldly from the head seat and felt it was strange. Under Minister Fan's management, the Ministry of Revenue was indeed different from the other ministries. Although the assistant minister was not a minor official, it was interesting that he dared to contradict the Crown Prince like this. He knew that the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue was angry and couldn't resist smiling and explaining, "Assistant minister use words are not wrong. Since it is an investigation, it must be carried out in an orderly manner. Furthermore, it is best not to interfere with the daily work of the Ministry of Revenue. The government affairs of the entire country all require the transfer of money from the Ministry of Revenue. If for the sake of an investigation, it disturbs the administration of the Ministry of Revenue too much, presumably the Emperor would not want to see it." This assistant minister, surnamed Yu, was clearly much more respectful toward the scholar. He bowed and said in an even voice, "I will listen to all your instructions." Since they didn't know where to start the investigation, they had to first sort out all of the accounts of the Ministry of Revenue and then send specialized officials to verify them. The Overwatch Council, Ministry of Appointments, and Supreme Court all had such capable people. However, looking at it, it would be at least a day after tomorrow before they could start. An official suddenly said to Hu the scholar, "In my opinion, why don't we first take out the accounts of the Treasury and the Jiangnan Department to have a look?" The entire hall was silent. The Treasury stored silver from the National Treasury. If the Ministry of Revenue truly moved the treasury silver to Jiangnan, according to the deductions of all the civil and military officials in court, it would certainly go through the accounts of the Jiangnan department. This official straightforwardly proposed to first check the accounts of the treasury and the Jiangnan department. It was clearly directed at this rumor. The scholar was slightly startled and couldn't find any reason to object. Furthermore, he did want to know if the Ministry of Revenue was truly daring enough to privately move national funds to Jiangnan. He discussed it with the Crown Prince and then ordered the officials of the Overwatch Council and the Ministry of Revenue to first check the accounts of these two departments. The night passed uneventfully. The second day passed uneventfully. The third day passed uneventfully. From the beginning, the Qing court's investigation of the Ministry of Revenue had sunk into the boundless ocean of battle over accounts. The officials who wanted to find something wrong with the Ministry of Revenue were instantly drowned out by the accounts that were as numerous as a mountain of snow. In the spacious hall, the accounts were piled into a small mountain. The smell of old paper hung in the air, making it difficult for the investigating officials to breathe. Their eyes were filled with yellow paper and numbers that made them dizzy and confused. In the quiet investigation hall, there was the endless sound of pages flipping, the clattering of abacuses, and the occasional sound of tea being sipped. When the silence mixed with the monotonous, repetitive sounds, it was easy to hypnotize. Although the investigating officials sitting in the grand chairs did not have to personally face the terrifying and complicated numbers, they still felt physically and mentally tired and very sleepy. The investigating officials of each department had been busy for a few days, comparing the numbers on the accounts. Still, no problems had occurred. Currently, they were investigating the numbers of the Treasury and the Jiangnan department. For the time being, they had not found anything that could be used against the Ministry of Revenue. This surprised everyone. Even the scholar, who was secretly leaning toward the Fan family, felt it was strange. With so many accounts, even if it was not intentional, even if it was unintentional, there had to be some mistakes, right? With such a large amount of calculation work, did the Ministry of Revenue not make a single mistake these 2 years? It was said that when the water was too clear, there would be no fish. When the accounts were too clear, there would be falsehoods. It was impossible for such perfect accounts to exist in this world. If there was, then it had to be fake accounts. The scholar thought this way. The investigating officials of the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Justice also thought this way. Thus, they investigated with increasing vigor. As long as they could find a single flaw, they could move the whole body and drag the entire Ministry of Revenue down. After this warm but tedious afternoon ended, the officials buried in the accounts of the various departments raised their heads and glanced at each other with astonishment. They then shook their heads at their respective superiors, causing countless feelings of disappointment to surge in the hearts of the investigating officials. There was no problem, at least there was nothing wrong with the accounts of the Ministry of Revenue in the Jiangnan Department and Treasury. The Ministry of Revenue that had been investigated was very clean, abnormally clean. It was as clean as a naked virgin after a bath. Something's wrong. The Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, who had hurried to the Ministry of Revenue this afternoon, shook his head and said to the scholar beside him, "This is too abnormal." The scholar nodded. Yan Hangshu narrowed his eyes and thought for a bit. Of course, we won't be able to find any problems just by investigating the accounts of these two places. Some people are not idiots. They clearly know that the court is suspicious of this area. Of course, they have to smooth out the accounts in this area. However, all of the accounts and treasury are under our control. The items and numbers have to match up. If there really is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue, then it must be done by transferring silver and smoothing things out. I think our next step is not to just focus on these places. We should expand outwards and investigate the 7 departments and the 3 great treasuries. All of the accounts have to be gathered together and investigated. We will certainly find something fishy within. The scholar furrowed his brows and said, "Putting aside the fact that it is too difficult, it will take a long time." The Crown Prince listened at the side. A strange feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. Did none of the officials beside him profit from the Treasury under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Revenue? How could they all be so daring as to expand the scope of the accounts limitlessly? He thought about it and agreed with Yin Hongshu's suggestion. Being able to deal with the Fan family was what he hoped to see the most. The news of a complete accounting spread quickly from the Ministry of Revenue to the Fan Manor. Fan Jian, who claimed to be ill in bed, did not change his expression. He only said to himself, when an artist makes false accounts, he has to strive for perfection. Go ahead and investigate. The wider the better. The bigger the problem you find, the better. Busy being sick, busy buying tickets, busy packing, and going home tomorrow, both physically and mentally exhausted. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 388. I don't know why the people of Guangzhou like cats so much. Or is there someone in Hubei who doesn't want him to go home? Due to the heavy snow, the plane can't take off. Student Cat is still hanging out at the Guangzhou airport. According to the worst-case scenario, the plane can't take off today, or even if it can take off, it'll be very late when he gets home, so he won't be able to update. The better-case scenario is that Student Cat loves his job and works hard to write and update even when he gets home late. I think this is basically very difficult. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 389. The Ministry of Revenue's investigation continued. Following the expansion of the battle lines and the increase in the number of people invested by the various departments, they finally found some clues that could be used in the old account books. The officials of the investigation group finally relaxed. Regardless of how many problems the informants could uncover in the Ministry of Revenue, as long as there was a good beginning, it would break the flawless image of the Ministry of Revenue under Minister Fan's leadership. The first problem was in the winter coat money sent to Tsangzhou in the 4th year of the Qin calendar. The amount was not large. Moving up from this line, it was like a snowball. The gap that the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue had hidden under layers of cover grew larger and larger. Gradually, it was startlingly exposed in front of the investigating officials. The Crown Prince and Minister of Appointments, Yin Hangshu, were overjoyed. They did not care at all about who the scholars request to be safe. They ordered their subordinates to dig deeper and deeper. All the way from the county to the capital, they dug up the complicated lines from the root. Gradually, the evidence in their hands approached Jingdou. In other words, it approached the bodies of the high-ranking officials who could actually sign. The left and right assistant ministers who had been in charge of being investigated in the Ministry of Revenue also began to tremble in fear. This account for the winter coats had originally been planned and something they had looked over. However, they had not expected that behind a mere 100,000 liang of silver winter coat, so many things would be pulled out. Regardless of whether it was the court or the merchants, when they did accounts, they were best at shattering large gaps into countless small pieces of paper and then scattering them into the large projects. Like salt in a raging snow or water in a flood, they would disappear without a trace. No one had thought that the burden of scattering the winter coats would not be done properly. Instead, it would give a game away. The left and right assistant ministers stayed at the Ministry of Revenue Yamen all night with ashen faces. When they were off duty that day, they were prepared to ignore the discussion and go to the minister's manor to find an idea. Unexpectedly, the Crown Prince coldly said that before this matter was fully investigated, the officials of the Ministry of Revenue should not leave without permission. At the same time, he had moved the Overwatch Council and a few trusted aides to keep an eye on these two assistant ministers. Ever since Fan Jian entered officialdom, he had always worked in the Ministry of Revenue. Regardless of how the name of the Ministry of Revenue changed before and after the new policies, or how the structure of personnel in court changed. He had worked his way up from a small position. 9 years ago, he was already the left assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. At that time, the minister of the Ministry of Revenue was old and sick at home. The emperor favored Fan Jian, but it was not convenient for him to skip ranks to promote him. Thus, he forcibly had the sick old minister occupy the position and did not allow other factions to send people in. This made it convenient for Fan Jian to use the position of assistant minister to command the entire Ministry of Revenue. In the blink of an eye, 9 years had passed. During these 9 years, the Qing emperor had favored the Fan manor greatly. Fan Jian had also used these 9 years to turn the entire Ministry of Revenue into an interest group that was as solid as a metal plate. It was a very quiet and unostentatious interest group. So when the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue began, all of the officials in the Ministry of Revenue looked up at their minister. They knew that as long as the minister did not fall, nothing would happen to them. Now, the Ministry of Revenue seemed to have sunk into danger. The left and right assistant ministers were unable to enter the Fan manor. For a moment, the officials of the Ministry of Revenue were fearful and uneasy. The left and right assistant ministers could not come, but Fan Jian had been the Ministry of Revenue for a long time. He completely understood the tense situation these 2 days. That night, he knew that the Crown Prince and the officials investigating had found a fatal weapon in the Ministry of Revenue, the winter jackets of the northern soldiers. That won't move me. Fan Jian sat in the study and drank some sour berries. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "Regardless of who goes to Songzhou to patrol, the jackets worn by the soldiers are all of the best quality. No matter how useless I am, I would not make an issue of the bitter cold of the Sioux soldiers." Today, he was not talking to a portrait. The person sitting across from him was a living person. It was the Fan Manor's assistant, Sir Zheng Tuo, who had always been deeply appreciated by Fan Jian. Back then, when Fan Xian was fighting a big underground case in the Jingdou government, the person in charge was Sir Zheng Tuo. He had previously been an old official of the Ministry of Revenue. Because he had done things efficiently, Fan Jian had him leave the Ministry of Revenue and use the more convenient identity of an assistant to do things for him. Zheng Tuo thought for a bit and furrowed his brows. That batch of winter jackets was not only not defective goods, on the contrary, the workmanship was very careful. The materials used were also very particular. The cotton was, of course, from the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury. The cotton cloth was also a first-class product of the palace treasury. Some of the other accessories were even goods from Dongyi that were used as an exception. The court could not say anything wrong about this, but he wanted to say something but stopped. Fan Jian smiled and said, "You've been with me for so many years. You should know that I do things carefully. However, when I analyze things, I am not afraid to consider the worst possible angle." Zheng Tuo forced a smile and said, "However, the materials used for that batch of winter jackets were not bad. Later, when the Ministry of Revenue negotiated the price, they set it very high. The silver transferred from the National Treasury seems to have been a bit too much." "Speak more directly." "Yes, Master," Zheng Tuo said. "The Ministry of Revenue took a lot of silver from that batch of winter jackets. Later, it was all used in other places." "Correct," Fan Jian expressionlessly said. "This batch of winter jackets did indeed take some silver. That was because that month's official salary in the capital was almost unable to be paid out. The emperor did not know of this situation, and I did not have the heart to trouble the emperor with this matter. At that time, the silver from the palace treasury had not arrived, and we also had to prepare the rewards for the Western Expedition Army the next year. The ministry had no choice but to take some silver from this batch of winter jackets." He waved his hand and smiled. However, this amount of silver was not large. It was also not used in other places. "Yes, sir," Zheng Tuo said with a face full of worry. "The winter jackets are only one end. This time, the court is investigating the ministry. There will be more and more things like this. Once the matter of transferring silver to fill in the deficit is brought to the capital, I'm afraid It will ultimately point to the batch of silver that the ministry finally transferred to Jiangnan. Fan Jian sighed and shook his head. There is no other way. The main reason for transferring silver to Jiangnan this time is for the palace treasury bidding. This does not have much to do with Enji. However, as the Minister of Revenue, I also want the palace treasury's income to be a bit better. If the court does not take money to go against the Ming family, how could the Ming family be willing to take out so much silver? He lowered his head and quietly said, Actually, at the very beginning, I had already entered the palace to talk to the emperor about the transfer of this batch of silver. The study was deathly silent. Zheng Tao was dumbfounded and couldn't speak for a moment. The excuse for investigating the Ministry of Revenue was that the Ministry of Revenue was secretly transferring national funds to Jiangnan for profit. Who would have thought that the palace actually knew about this large transfer of silver? He calmed down with great difficulty and furrowed his brows. Master, since it is something that the emperor has tacitly agreed to, let's make it clear. Fan Jian shook his head firmly. The emperor has his own difficulties. If the matter of the court secretly harming the wealthy Ming family in Jiangnan gets out, their reputation will be too ugly. However, right now, everyone in court is guessing that matter. The emperor has no choice but to investigate. He sighed and said, Since it is so, how can we make it clear? Then what do we do? Zheng Tuo asked in shock. The meaning of these words was clear. It was originally a matter that the emperor was in charge of. Was it just to quell the discussion and that Minister Fan didn't want to be forced to be the scapegoat? Fan Jian's expression was calm. As an official, of course I have to share the emperor's burden. The Ministry of Revenue's transfer of silver this time is too big. In the end, it cannot be hidden. If in the end, the ministry is still found out, I will have no choice but to stand up for the emperor and end this matter. The method the court used to deal with the Ming family was not honorable. Furthermore, there were countless court officials supporting the Ming family. For the sake of the stability of the Qing court, this method, which the emperor had tacitly agreed to, could not be announced to the court. Zheng Tuo's expression was moved and sorrowful. He thought to himself that Minister Fan was indeed a loyal official. At such a time, he was still thinking of protecting the emperor's face and the court's interests. Sir, resign, Zheng Tuo said painfully. It has already come to this. There is no need to continue stubbornly holding on. Fan Jian shook his head, his interest waning. Zheng Tuo once again tried to persuade him painfully. I know you're not a person who longs for wealth. Looking at the present situation, the emperor has long planned to stop investigating the Ministry of Revenue matter after you resign. As long as you resign from the position of minister, it can be considered a conclusion to the transfer of national funds. Presumably, the second prince and the eldest princess will not continue to pursue the matter. Hu the scholar and Shu the scholar will also speak up for you. As Fan Jian's confidant, Zheng Tuo had already suggested this many times, but Fan Jian had never agreed. He faintly sighed and said, There are some things that clearly can be done and left unscathed, but I just can't do it. Fan Jian lowered his eyelids and said, The Ministry of Revenue has always been managed by me. The court has been at war for many years and has used up countless amounts of silver. The Great River has also been short of banks for 3 years in a row. In this world, no one knows better than me how empty the national treasury is, and no one understands better than me the current dangerous situation. All of the officials think that it is still a time of peace and prosperity. In reality, who knows the danger hidden under the prosperity? But Sir Fan Jr. has already gone to Jiangnan. As long as the palace treasury returns to the right path, the danger to the national treasury will be alleviated, Zheng Tuo said anxiously. Fan Jian laughed quietly in his heart. If the situation in the palace treasury was not completely under Fan Xian's control, if the emperor was not confident he could turn the situation around in the Qing kingdom's national treasury within 2 years, how could that son of heaven be willing to let him resign? Although he thought this in his heart, his face was incomparably pained. He said, It is because Fan Xian has just taken charge of the palace treasury, and the situation is good that I cannot leave right now. Fan Jian sighed and said, First, it is because it is a crucial period from decline to prosperity. I don't dare to let go. I still want to manage it for the emperor for another 2 years. Second, it is because of Ng. He appears calm and cold, but in reality, he is a passionate and ruthless person. If I truly resign, and it is because of the matter of transferring silver to the palace treasury, given his personality, I'm afraid he will immediately resign from his position in the palace treasury transport company and come back to the capital to seek justice for me. Zheng Tuo's face was full of shock. After thinking carefully, he realized that what the minister said did make some sense. It's getting late. You should go back first. Fan Jian closed his eyes and said, as for the matters of the ministry, you don't have to worry too much. Although the sparks of the various departments have been lit and will one day burn me, or even myself, as long as I can hold out for one day, I will stay another day. Furthermore, once the fire grows, who knows how many people it will burn? Zheng Tuo sighed and deeply admired the minister's dedication to the public. He didn't say anything more and left the study. He left the fan manor and got into his own carriage. Returning to his home, he spread out a piece of paper and wrote a secret letter. He gave it to someone in the manor and then lay on his bed. His eyes were wide open, and he could not sleep for a long time. Until today, Zheng Tuo, the fan manor's assistant, asked himself honestly and still could not be sure what kind of person he was. The Minister of Revenue Fan Jian actually did not know what kind of person his confidant, the assistant who had followed him for so many years, was, but he knew one thing. Zheng Tuo was not one of his people. Zheng Tuo was one of the emperor's people. However, he didn't know if he had been placed by his side through the Overwatch Council or if he had gone through the internal court. Regardless of which route it was, Fan Jian knew that his every move these years had been watched by that man in the palace. Thus, all of Fan Jian's actions these years have been acted for that man to see, including tonight's painful and righteous analysis. Fan Jian was not Lin Ruofu. He would not be beaten down by the people closest to him. From that night many years ago, amidst the sound of the drums in the west, he had made up his mind. He would never, ever trust a single person in Jingdo again. The Ministry of Revenue had indeed moved a large amount of silver to Jiangnan. Furthermore, the movement of this silver had been tacitly approved by the Qing Emperor. Thus, when the palace was angry because of this matter and ordered the 3 departments to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, Fan Jian was unexpectedly angry and felt a sense of absurd drama. He couldn't help but laugh involuntarily. Of course, this batch of national funds being moved to Jiangnan was not to be used against the Ming family. Fan Jian knew that his extraordinary son had long gathered a shocking amount of silver. He just didn't know where this silver had come from. Fan Jian moving the silver to Jiangnan was actually to cover for Fan Xian. Old Fan's way of thinking was clearly more shrewd and ruthless than little Fan's. He did not believe that Fan Xian could use the excuse of the Yi family's inheritance to convince the emperor of the sudden increase in silver in Xia Qifei's hands. Every time he thought of this, Fan Jian couldn't help but sigh. Fan Xian was indeed becoming more and more daring in the way he did things. He dared to ally with Qing Kingdom's long-standing enemy, Northern Qi. His son was causing trouble, and as a father, he had no choice but to cover it up. In order to ensure that his son's plan could proceed smoothly, the Ministry of Revenue had to put some silver into the money house to ensure that they could withdraw money at any time. This was the entire truth behind the Ministry of Revenue's private transfer of national funds to Jiangnan. In this plan, although the Ministry of Revenue moved a large amount, very little was actually spent. Most of the shares had made a circle around Jiangnan and had long returned to the Ministry of Revenue. Thus, Fan Jian was not worried at all that the Crown Prince and the Minister of Appointments could actually find anything. Other than that, Fan Jian had purposely left some to go to the Riverworks Yamen. If the emperor wanted an official who did not have any major loopholes to resign, he only needed to create a ruckus and, through clever hints from certain people, have that official resign. Even the treacherous Prime Minister Lin Ruofu had fallen into this kind of arrangement. Fan Jian did not want to accept the emperor's arrangements, nor did he want to return to Danzhou so early to retire. Thus, he let the Ministry of Revenue investigate. Only by muddying the waters could he better demonstrate his innocence. At the same time, he had to use Zheng Kuo's mouth to stab the man sitting on the dragon chair. Only that man believed that Fan Jian was loyal, foolish, and stupid, yet indispensable. Only then could Fan Jian continue to stand proudly in this dark Jingdou and watch Fan Xian's growth with the gaze of a loving father. It's all under control, right? Fan Jian carefully glanced at the letter. It was addressed to his son far away in Jiangnan before he opened his mouth to speak. A black-clothed man stood in front of him and bowed deeply. Zheng Kuo and Yuan Bo are the same. They both have no children. They're probably both people of the Overwatch Council. Fan Jian furrowed his brows and said, Yuan Bo is really a person of the Overwatch Council? No wonder my in-laws fell so quickly. The black-clothed man said in a heavy voice, but Zheng Kuo has a nephew. According to my investigations, it should be his own son. However, he was afraid the palace would use this son to threaten him, so he has never admitted it. Fan Jian's brows rose, and he smiled slightly. Very good, we can threaten him now. The black-clothed man nodded silently. His hand were placed flat by his side. From the web between his thumb and index finger, there was a long callus. If Fan Xian had seen this detail, he would certainly be able to think of the calluses formed by Gouda and the other tiger guard from holding long knives for many years. Fan Jian gazed at the black-clothed man and said, Following me, there really isn't much to do. You've been bored out of your mind these years. Don't blame me. The black-clothed man smiled and said sincerely, 11 years ago, my defenses weren't strong enough and allowed the serving girls by the Empress Dowager's side to be killed by a madman. I was already a dead person. It was all thanks to you remembering our old friendship and secretly saving me. If it weren't for you saving my life, I'm afraid I would have long been playing around in the dirt. Fan Jian smiled and shook his head. You have this kind of frivolous personality, not at all like a tiger guard. No wonder the emperor didn't like you the most back then. He then said, Keep an eye on Zheng Kuo. If necessary, send his son's right hand to his room. I've been sick for the past few days. Yesterday, I took an early flight and left home at 5 o'clock. I arrived at the airport and boarded the plane. The plane flew for a long time. Then, the gentle voice of the stewardess rang out. Yichang is snowing heavily. We cannot land. So, the plane turned back to Guangzhou. I stayed at the airport and stayed at the hotel to eat Hunan cuisine. Then, I was informed that I could land. Overjoyed, I went to the airport again and boarded the plane. The plane flew for a long time through layers of snow and clouds and landed in Yichang, which was 3 degrees below zero. It was very cold. I took the bus back to the city. When I got off the bus, I couldn't find a taxi, so I took the bus. It was said that Yichang's Yunji tunnel had collapsed and the entire route was sealed. The bus took a detour to number 403. It was said that there was a traffic accident at number 403. When I returned home, it was already dark and I was very weak. So, Yichang had snow that couldn't fall. That was why I had these problems. It wasn't because of the heavy snow in Guangzhou that my leader had mentioned when he asked for leave yesterday. If I had known that there would be heavy snow in Guangzhou, then I would have been wronged too much. At that time, Guangzhou was full of sunshine and the sky was blue. I stood in the bright sunshine of the southern kingdom and cursed the snow in Yichang. It wasn't over yet. When I returned home, there was a problem with my hard drive. I had already known about this and bought a 250 gigabytes hard drive in Guangzhou, so I didn't think much of it. But when I installed the new hard drive, I was shocked to find that I didn't have a CD-ROM drive. How was I going to install the system? I struggled for half the night. I found my brother-in-law's CD-ROM drive and installed the new system. Then I was shocked to find that I couldn't recognize the old hard drive when I installed it. How was I going to copy the things on it? Don't worry, I still have a USB drive. This thing is good. But in the end, I confirmed that the old hard drive was broken. Finally, I stopped updating for the first time since I started writing. I felt a little strange. It was as if some record had been broken, as if the Celtics had finally lost. Then I was surprised. When did I become such a hard-working person? I worked so hard that it took me a long time to sleep. I woke up very late today. I could still use my brother-in-law's computer at home, so I had no problem writing. But I was sad and scared. I was scared that the data on the old hard drive would no longer be extracted. There were a lot of things on it. My century of love, my dream couple, my godfather, my alien. The scariest thing was that there were all the things I had written in the past 7 years. Ingshio roasted chicken, the first draft of Chong, the beginning, and some small essays like nonsense. The scariest thing was that there were all the things I had experienced in the past few years, including my letters, screenshots, chat records, and archive files. The USB drive was good, but there was only Chong on it. Chong was only a small part of my life. The hard drive contained the traces of my life in the past 7 or 8 years. I couldn't accept the fact that they might disappear. So, I have to repair the hard drive. I'm feeling very down. Tomorrow, I'm going to repair the hard drive. Please bless me, Wu Zhu. I might have written less carelessly these 2 days. Please forgive me. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.